Chapter 26 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 26. The Test. The most that could be said of Rickert was that it had a courthouse and plenty of quiet so perfect that the minds of the office holders could turn and hear no sound saving their own turning. There were, of course, more buildings than the courthouse, but not so many that they could not be grouped conveniently along one street. The hush which rested over Rickert was never broken except in the periods immediately after the spring and fall round-ups, when the saloons and gaming tables were suddenly flooded with business. Otherwise it was a rare event indeed, which injected excitement into the village. Such an event was the gathering of Sheriff Pete Glass's posse. There had been other occasions when Pete and officers before his time had combed the county to get the cream of the fighting men, but the gathering of the new posse became different in many ways. In the first place, the call for members was not confined to the county, for though it stretched as large as many a minor European kingdom, it had not the population of a respectable manufacturing town, and Pete Glass went far beyond its bounds to get his trailers. Everywhere he had the posters set up, and on the posters appeared the bait. The state began the game with a reward of $3,000. The county plastered $2,000 on top of that to make it an even $5,000. Then the town of Alder dug into its deep pockets and produced $2,500, while disinterested parties added contributions, which swelled the total to around $10,000. $10,000 reward for the man described below, dead or alive. $10,000 which might be earned by the investment of a single bullet and the pressure on trigger, and above this the fame which such a deed would bring. No wonder that the mountain desert hummed through all its peaks and plains and stirred to life. Moreover, the news had gone abroad. The tale of the killing of Alder and everything that went before. It went west. It appeared in newspapers, it cropped up at firesides, it gave a spark of terror to a myriad conversations. And everyone in Rickert felt that the eye of the nation was upon it. Everyone in Rickert dreamed nightly of the man described. Daniel Barry, called Whistlin' Dan, about 5'9" or 10", slender, black hair, brown eyes, age about 30 years. Secretly, Rickert felt perfectly convinced that Sheriff Pete Glass alone could handle this fellow and trim his claws, for they knew how many a bad man had built a reputation high as Babel and baffled posses and murdered right and left, until the little dusty man on the little dusty roan went out alone and came back alone, and another fierce name went from history into legend. However, there were doubters, since this affair had new earmarks. It had been buzzed abroad that Whistlin' Dan was not only the hunted, but also the hunter, and that he had pledged himself to strike down all the 7 who first took his trail. 5 of these were already gone, 2 remained, and of these 2, one was Vic Gregg, no despicable fighter himself, and the other was no less than the invincible little sheriff himself. To imagine the sheriff beaten in the speed of his draw or the accuracy of his shot was to imagine the first cause, infinity, or whatever else is inconceivable. Nevertheless, there were such possibilities as bullets fired at night through the window, and attacks from the rear, so Rickert waited and held its breath and kept its eyes rather more behind than in front. In the meantime, there was no lack of amusement. For from the 4 corners, blown by the 4 winds, men rode out of the mountain desert and drifted into Rickert to seek for a place on that posse. 20 men, that was the goal the sheriff had set, 20 men trained to a hair. Beside the courthouse was a shooting gallery, not overmuch used except during the 2 annual seasons of prosperity and reckless spending, and Pete Glass secured the place to test out applicants. After they passed this trial, they were mustered into his presence, and he gave them an examination for himself. Just what he asked them or what they could do might never be known, but some men came from his presence very red, and others extremely pale, and some men blustered, and some men swore, and some men rode hastily out of town and never spoke a word. But few, Very few were those who came out wearing a little badge on their vest with the pride of a Knight of the Garter. At first the hordes rode in, young and old, youths keen for a taste of adventure, rusty fellows who had once been noted warriors. But these early levies soon discovered that courage and willingness was not so much valued as accuracy, and the old-timers learned also that accuracy must be accompanied by speed. And even when a man possessed both these qualities of hand and eye, the gentle, inscrutable little man in his office might still reject them for reasons they could not guess. This one thing was certain. The next time Pete Glass ran for office, he would be beaten even by a greaser. He made enemies at the rate of 100 a day during that period of selection. Still, the 20 was not recruited to the full. 13, 14, 15 were gathered into the fold, but still 5 men were lacking to complete the toll. Most men would have started their manhunt with that formidable force, but Pete Glass was methodical. In his own heart of hearts he would have given his hope of heaven to meet Barry face to face and hand to hand and see which was the better man, but Pete Glass owed a duty to his state before he owed a duty to himself. He stuck by his first plan, and every day the inhabitants of Rickard gathered at the shooting gallery to watch the tests and wonder at the successes and smile at the failures. It was a very hard test which the sheriff had imposed. A man stood to one side of the iron plate back wall which served as the target. He stood entirely out of sight, and through an aperture in the side wall at a signal he tossed a round ball of clay painted white. The marksman stood a good 10 paces off, and he must strike that clay ball as it passed across the target. The balls were so small that even to strike them when they were stationary was a difficult task, and to hit them in motion was enough to task the quickest eye and the cunningest hand. It was old Pop Giersberg who stood with his ancient .45 behind the counter with his feet braced on this bright morning, and behind him half of Rickard was gathered. "D'you give me warnin', son?" he inquired of the man at the counter. "Nary a warnin'," grinned the other, who was one of the chosen 15. He wished Pop well. So did they all, but they had seen every man fail for 2 days at that target, and one and all they had their doubts. Pop had been a formidable man in his day, but now his hand was stiff and his hair gray. He was at least 20 years older than he felt. He had hardly finished asking his question when the white ball was tossed across the target. Up came the gun of Pop Giersberg, exploded, and the bullet clanged on the iron. The white ball floated idly on across the wall and disappeared on the other side. "Give me another chance," pleaded Pop with a quaver in his voice. "That was just a try to get my eye in shape." "Sure," chuckled the deputy. "Everybody gets 3 tries. It ain't hardly natural to hit that ball the first crack. Leastwise, nobody ain't done it yet. You just keep your eye peeled, Pop, and that ball will come out again." And Pop literally kept his eye peeled. He had double reason to pray for success, for his old woman had smiled and shook her head when he allowed that he would try out for a place on that posse. All his nerves grew taut and keen. He waited. Once more the white streak appeared, and surely he who threw the ball had every wish to see Pop succeed, for he tossed it high and easily. Again the gun barked from Giersberg's hand, and again the ball dropped almost slowly out of sight. "It's a trick," gasped Pop. "It's something damn queer." "There's a considerable pile of gents that think the same way you do," admitted the deputy sheriff dryly. Pop glared at him and gritted his teeth. "Lead the damn thing on again," he said, and muttered the rest of his sentence to himself. He jerked his hat lower over his eyes, spread his feet a little more, and got ready for the last desperate chance. But fate was against Pop. 20 years before he might have struck that mark if he had been in top condition, but today, though he put his very soul into the effort, and though the ball for the 3rd time was lobbed with the utmost gentleness through the air, his bullet banged vainly against the sheet of iron, and the white, inoffensive ball continued on its way. Word came in the throat of Pop, reached his open mouth, and died there. He thrust the gun back into its holster and turned slowly toward the crowd. There was no smile to meet his challenging eye, for Pop was a known man, and though he might have failed to strike this elusive mark, that was no sign he would fail to hit something 6 feet in height by a couple in breadth. When he found that no mockery awaited him, a sheepish smile began at his eyes and wandered dimly to his lips. "Well, gents," he muttered, "I guess I ain't as young as I was once. So long." He shouldered his way to the door and was gone. "That's about all, friends," said the deputy crisply. "I guess there ain't any more clamoring for a place today." He swept the crowd with a complacent eye. "If you've got no objection," murmured a newcomer who had just slipped into the room, "I'd sort of like to take a shot at that." End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 27. The Sixth Man. It caused a quick turning of heads. "I don't want to put you out none," said the applicant gently. His voice was extremely gentle, and there was about him all the shrinking aloofness of the naturally timid. The deputy looked him over with quiet amusement. Slender fellow, with the gentlest brown eyes, and then with a quick side glance invited the crowd to get in on the joke. "You ain't putting me out," he assured the other. "Not if you pay for your own ammunition." "Oh, yes," answered the would-be manhunter. "I reckon I could afford that." He was so serious about it that the crowd murmured its amusement rather than bursting into loud laughter. If the man was a fool, at least he was not aggressive in his folly. They gave way, and he walked slowly towards the counter and stepped into the little open space beside the master of ceremonies. Very obviously he was ill at ease to find himself the center of so much attention. "I suppose you been practicing up on tin cans?" suggested the deputy, leaning on the counter. "Oh, sometimes I hit things, and sometimes I don't," answered the stranger. "Well," and this was put more crisply as the deputy brought out a large pad of paper, "just give me your name, partner." "Joe Cumber." He grew still more ill at ease. "I hear that even if you hit the mark you got to talk to the sheriff himself afterwards?" "Yep." The applicant sighed. "Why'd you ask?" "I ain't much on words." "But hell with your gun, eh?" The deputy sheriff grinned again, but when the other turned his head toward him his smile went out, suddenly, while the wrinkle of mirth still lay in his cheek. The deputy stroked his chin and looked thoughtful. "Get your gun ready," he ordered. The other slipped his hand down to his gun butt and moved his weapon to make sure that it was perfectly loose in the leather. "Ain't you going to take your gun out?" queried the deputy. "Can I do that?" "I reckon not," said the deputy, and looked the stranger straight in the eyes. His change to deadly earnestness put a hush over the crowd. Across the target, not tossed easily as it had been for Pop Giersberg, but literally thrown, darted the line of white, while the gun flipped out of its holster as if it possessed a life of its own and spoke. The white line ended halfway to the farther side of the target, and the revolver slid again into hiding. A clamor of amazement broke from the crowd, but the deputy looked steadily, without enthusiasm, at the stranger. "Joe Cumber," he said, when the noise fell away a little. "I guess you'll see the sheriff. Harry, take Joe Cumber up to Pete, will you?" One of the bystanders jumped at the suggestion and led the other from the room, with a full half of the crowd following. The deputy remained behind, thoughtful. "What's the matter?" asked one of the spectators. "You look like you seen a ghost." "Gents," answered the deputy, "do any of you recollect seeing this fellow before?" They did not. "They's something queer about him," muttered the deputy. "He may be word shy," proffered a wit, "but he sure ain't gun shy." "When he looked at me," said the deputy, more to himself than to the others, "it seemed to me like they was a swirl of yaller come into his eyes. Made me feel like someone had sneaked up behind me with a knife." In his thoughtfulness his eyes wandered, and wandering they fell upon the notice of the reward for the capture, dead or alive, of Daniel Barry, about 5 feet 9 or 10, slender, with black hair and brown eyes. "My God!" cried the deputy, but then he relaxed against the counter. "It ain't possible." "What ain't possible?" "However, I'm going to go and hang around. Gents, I got a crazy idea." He had no sooner started toward the door than he seemed to gain surety out of the motion. "It's him!" he cried. He turned toward the others, white of face. "Come on, all of you. It's him, Barry." But in the meantime Harry had gone on swiftly to the office of the sheriff with Joe Cumber. Behind him swirled the curious crowd, and for their benefit he asked his questions loudly. "Partner, that was sure a pretty play you made. I seen 'em all try out to crack them balls, but I never seen none of 'em do it the way you did, with your gun in the leather to start. What part of the country might you be from?" The other answered gently. "Why, from over yonder." "The T.O. outfit, huh?" "Beyond that." "Up in the Gray Mountains, that so? I suppose you've been on trails like this before." "Nothing to talk about." There might have been a double meaning in this remark, and Harry looked twice to make sure that there was no guile. "Well, here we are." He threw open a door which revealed a bald-headed clerk seated at a desk in a little bare room. "Billy, here's a gent that cracked it the first whack and started his gun from the holster, by God. He'd just kindly close the door, Harry," said Billy. "Step in, partner. Give 'em your name." The door closed on the discomfited Harry, and Joe Cumber stood close to it, apparently driven to shrinking into the wall in his embarrassment, but while he stood there his hand fumbled behind him and turned the key in the lock, and then extracted it. "My name's Joe Cumber." "Joe Cumber," this while inscribing it. "Age?" "About 32, maybe." "Don't you know?" "I don't exactly." His eyes were as vague as his words, gentle and smiling. 32, said Billy sharply. "Look more like 25 to me. Suppose we split the difference, eh?" And with a grin he wrote, "Age 22 or 3. "Business?" "Trapper." "Good. The sheriff is pretty keen for them. You gents in that game got a sort of nose for the trail, mostly. All right, Cumber, you'll see glass." He stood at the door. "By the way, Cumber, is that straight about starting your shot with your gun in the holster?" "I suppose it is." "You suppose?" grunted the clerk. "Well, come on in." He banged once on the door and then threw it open. "Joe Cumber, Pete. And he drilled the ball starting his gun out of the leather. Here's his card." He closed the door, and once more the stranger stood almost cringing against it, and once more his fingers deftly turned the key softly, silently, and extracted it from the lock. The sheriff had not looked up from the study of the card, for reading was more difficult to him than man-killing, and Joe Cumber had an opportunity to examine the room. It was hung with a score of pictures, some large, some small, but most of them enlargements. It was apparent of Kodak snapshots, for the eyes had that bleary look which comes in photographs spread over 10 times their intended space. The faces had little more than bleary eyes in common, for there were bearded men and smooth-shaven faces, and lean and fat men. There were round cherubic countenances and lean, hungry heads. There were squared, protruding chins. There were chins which sloped away awkwardly toward the neck. In fact, it seemed that the sheriff had collected 20 specimens to represent every phase of weakness and strength in the human physiognomy. But beneath the pictures, almost without exception, there hung weapons. Rifles, revolvers, knives, placed crisscross in a decorative manner, and it came to Joe Cumber that he was looking at the galaxy of the dead who had fallen by the hand of Sheriff Pete Glass. Not a face meant anything to him, but he knew instinctively that they were the chosen bad men of the past 20 years. "So you're Joe Cumber." The sheriff turned in his swivel chair and tossed his cigarette butt through the open window. What can I do for you?" "I got an idea, Sheriff, that maybe you'd sort of like to have my picture." The sheriff looked up from his study of the card, and having looked up his eyes remained riveted. The other no longer cringed with embarrassment, but every line of his body breathed a great happiness. He was like one who had been riding joyously with a sharp wind in his face. There was a distant rushing of feet, a pounding on the door of the next room. "What's that?" muttered the sheriff, his attention called away. "They want me." "Wait a minute," called the voice of Billy without. "I'll open the door. By God, it's locked." "They want me. 5'9" or 10, slender, black hair and brown eyes. "Barry!" "Glass, I've come for you." "And I'm ready. And I'll say this," he was standing now, and his nervous hands were at his sides, "I've been hungering and hoping for this time to come. Barry, before you die, I want to thank you." "You followed me like a skunk," said Barry, "from the time you killed a hoss that had never done no harm to you. You got on my trail when I was living peaceable." There was a tremendous beating on the outer door of the outer room, but Barry went on. "You took a gent that was living straight, and you made a sneak and a crook out of him and sent him to double-cross me. You ain't worth living. You've spent your life hunting men, and now you're at the end of your trail. Think it over. You're ready to kill again, but are you ready to die?" The little dusty man grew dustier still. His mouth worked. "Damn you," he whispered, and went for his gun. It was out, his finger on the trigger, the barrel whipping into line when the weapon in Barry's hand exploded. The sheriff spun on his heel and fell on his face. 3 times as he lay there, dead in all except the instinctive movement of his muscles, his right hand clawed at the empty holster at his side. The 6th man had died for Grey Molly. The outer door of Billy's room crashed to the floor, and heavy feet thundered nearer. Barry ran to the window and whistled once, very high and thin. It brought a black horse racing around a corner nearby. It brought a wolf dog from an opposite direction, and as they drew up beneath the window he slid out and dropped lightly, cat-like, to the ground. One leap brought him to the saddle, and Satan stretched out along the street. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 28. The Blood of the Father. On the night of her failure at the cave, Kate came back to the cabin and went to her room without any word to Buck or Lee Haines. But when they sat before the fire, silent or only murmuring, they could hear her moving about. Whatever sleep they got before morning was not free from dreams, for they knew that something was impending, and after breakfast they learned what it was. She struck straight out from the shoulder. She was going up to the cave, and if Dan was away she would take Joan by force. She needed help. Would they give it? They sat for a long time, looking at each other and then avoiding Kate with their eyes. It was not the fear of death, but something more which both of them connected with the figure of Whistling Dan. It was not until she took her light cartridge belt from the wall and buckled on her gun that they rose to follow. Before the first freshness of the morning passed, they were winding up the side of the mountain, Kate a little in the lead, for she alone knew the way. When they rounded the shoulder, the men reined their horses, with which Kate had provided them, and sat looking solemnly at each other. "Maybe we'll have no chance to talk alone again," said Lee Haines. "This is the last trail either for Barry or for us, and I don't think that Barry is that close to the end of his rope. Buck, give me your hand and say good-bye. All that a man can do against Whistling Dan, and that isn't much, I'll do. Having you along won't make us a whit stronger." "Thanks," growled Buck Daniels. "Just save that kind of farewell till I show Yeller. Hurry up. She's getting too far ahead." At the bottom of the ravine, where they dismounted for the precipitous slope above, Kate showed her first hesitation. "You both know what this means?" she asked them. "We sure do," replied Buck. Dan will find out you've helped me, and then he'll never forgive you. Will you risk even that?" "Kate," broke in Lee Haines, "don't stop for questions. Keep on, and we'll follow. I don't want to think of what may happen." She turned, and without a word, went up the steep incline. "What do you think of your soft girl now?" panted Buck at the ear of Haines. The latter flashed a significant look at him, but said nothing. They reached the top of the canyon wall and passed on among the boulders. Kate had drawn back to them now, and they walked as cautiously as if there were dried leaves underfoot. She had only lifted a finger of warning, and they knew that they were near to the crisis. She came to the great rock around which she had first seen the entrance to the cave on the day before. Inch by inch, with Buck and Lee following her example, they worked toward the edge of the boulder and peered carefully around it. There opened the cave, and in front of it was Joan, playing with what seemed to be a ball of gray fur. Her hair tumbled loose and bright about her shoulders. She wore the tawny hide which Kate had seen before, and on her feet, since the sharp rocks had long before worn out her boots, she had daintily fashioned moccasins. Bare knees, profusely scratched, bare arms rapidly browning to the color of the fur she wore. Haines and Buck had to rub their eyes and look again before they could recognize her. They must have made a noise, perhaps merely an intaking of breath, inaudible even to themselves, but clear to the ears of Joan. She was on her feet with bright, wild eyes glancing here and there. There was no suggestion of childishness in her, but a certain willingness to flee from a great danger or attack a weaker force. She stood alert rather than frightened, with her head back as if she scented the wind to learn what approached. The ball of gray fur straightened into the sharp ears and the flashing teeth of a coyote puppy. Buck Daniels slipped on a pebble, and at the sound the coyote darted to the shadow of a little shrub and crouched there, hardly distinguishable from the shade which covered it. And the child, with infinitely cunning instinct, raced to a patch of yellow sand and tawny rocks among which she cowered and remained there, moveless. One thing at least was certain. Whistling Dan was not in the cave, for if he had been, the child would have run to him for protection, or at least cried out in her alarm. This information Haines whispered to Kate, and she nodded, turning a white face toward him. Then she stepped out from the rock and went straight toward Joan. There was no stir in the little figure. Even the wind seemed to take part in the secret and did not lift the golden hair. Once the eyes of the child glittered as they turned toward Kate, but otherwise she made no motion, like a rabbit which will not budge until the very shadow of the reaching hand falls over it. So it was with Joan. And as Kate leaned silently over her, she sprang to her feet and darted between the hands of her mother and away among the rocks. Past the reaching hands of Lee Haines she swerved, but it was only to run straight into the grip of Buck Daniels. Up to that moment she had not uttered a sound, but now she screamed out, twisted in his arms, and beat furiously against his face. "Joan!" cried Kate. "Joan!" She reached Buck and unwound his arms from the struggling body of the child. "Honey, why are you afraid? Oh, my baby!" For an instant Joan stood free, wavering, and her eyes held steadily upon her mother, bright with nothing but fear and strangeness. Then something melted in her little round face. She sighed, "Munner," and stole a pace closer. A moment later Kate sat with Joan in her arms, rocking to and fro and weeping. "What's happened?" gasped Haines to Daniels. "What's happened to the kid?" "Don't talk," answered Buck, his face gray as that of Kate. "It's Dan's blood." He drew a great breath. "Did you see her try to bite me while I was holding her?" Kate had started to her feet, holding Joan in one arm and dashing away her tears with the free hand. All weakness was gone from her. "Hurry," she commanded. "We haven't any time to lose. Buck, come here. No, Lee, you're stronger. Honey, this is your Uncle Lee. He'll take care of you. He won't hurt you. Will you go to him?" Joan shrank away while she examined him, but the instincts of a child move with thrice the speed of a mature person's judgment. She read the kindly honesty which breathed from every line of Haines' face, and held out her arms to him. Then they started down the slope for the horses, running wildly, For the moment they turned their backs on the cave, the same thought was in the mind of each, the same haunting fear of that small, shrill whistle pursuing. Half running, half sliding, they went down to the bottom of the gorge, while the pebble they started rushed after them in small avalanches, and they even had to dodge rocks of considerable size, which came bounding after. Joan, alert upon the shoulder of Lee Haines, enjoyed every moment of it. Her hair tossed in the sun, her arms were outstretched for balance, so they reached the horses and climbed into the saddles. Then, without a word from one to the other, but with many a backward look, they started on the flight. By the time they reached the shoulder of the hill on the farther side, with a long stretch of downslope before them, they had placed a large handicap between them and the danger of pursuit. But still they were not at ease. On their trail, sooner or later, would come three powers working toward one end, the surety of Black Bart following the scent, the swiftness of Satan which never tired, and above all, the rider who directed them both and kept them to their work. His was the arm which could strike from the distance and bring them down. They spurted down the hill. No sooner were they in full motion than Joan, for the first time, seemed to realize what it was all about. She was still carried by Lee Haines, who cradled her easily in his powerful left arm, but now she began to struggle. Then she stiffened and screamed, "Daddy Dan! Daddy Dan!" "For God's sake, stop her mouth or he'll hear," groaned Buck Daniels. "He can't," said Haines. "We're too far away even if he were at the cave now." "I tell you he'll hear. Don't talk to me about distance." Kate reined her horse beside Lee. "Joan," she commanded. They were sweeping across the meadow now at an easy gallop. Joan screamed again, a wild plea for help. "Joan!" repeated Kate, and her voice was fierce. She raised her quirt and shook it. "Be quiet! Munner whip! Hard!" Another call died away on the lips of Joan. She looked at her mother with astonishment, and then with a new respect. "If you cry once more, Munner whip!" And Joan was silent, staring with wonder and defiance. When they came close to the cabin, Lee Haines drew rein, but Kate motioned him on. "Where to?" he called. "Back to the old ranch," she answered. "We've got to have help." He nodded in grim understanding, and they headed on down the slope toward the valley. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 29. Billy the Clerk. If Sheriff Pete Glass had been the typical hard-riding, sure-shooting officer of the law, as it is seen in the mountain desert, his work would have died with his death. But Glass had a mind as active as his hands, and therefore, for at least a little while, his work went on after him. He had gathered 15 practiced fighters, who represented, it might be said, the brute body of the law, and when they, with most of Rickard at their heels, burst down the door of the sheriff's office and found his body, they had only one thought, which was to swing into the saddle and ride on the trail of the killer, who was even now a diminishing cloud of dust down the street. He was riding almost due east, and the cry went up, "He's streaking it for the Morgan Hills! Get after him, boys!" So into the saddle they went with a rush, 15 tried men on 15 chosen horses, and went down the street with a roar of hoofbeats. That was the body and muscle of the sheriff's work, going out to avenge him, but the mind of the law remained behind. It was old Billy the Clerk. No one paid particular attention to Billy, and they never had. He was useless on a horse and ridiculous with a gun, and the only place where he seemed formidable was behind a typewriter. Now he sat looking down into the dead face of Pete Glass, trying to grasp the meaning of it all. From the first he had been with Pete. From the first the invincibility of the dusty little man had been the chief article of Billy's creed, and now his dull eyes, bleared with the 30 years of clerical labor, wandered around on the galaxy of dead men who looked down at him from the wall. He leaned over and took the hand of the sheriff as one would lean to help a fallen man, but the fingers were already growing cold. And then Billy realized for the first time that this was death. Pete Glass had been. Pete Glass was not. Next he knew that something had to be done. But what it was he could not tell, for he sat in the sheriff's office, and in that room he was accustomed to stop thinking and receive orders. He went back to his own little cubbyhole and sat down behind the typewriter. At once his mind cleared, thoughts came and linked themselves into ideas, pictures, plans. The murderer must be taken dead or alive, and those 15 men had ridden out to do the necessary thing. They had seemed irresistible as they departed. Indeed, no living thing they met could withstand them, human or otherwise, as Billy very well knew. Yet he recalled a saying of the sheriff, a thing he had insisted upon: "No man on no hoss will ever ride down Whistlin' Dan Barry. It's been tried before, and it's never worked. I've looked up his history, and it can't be done. If he's going to be ran down, it's got to be done with relays, like you was running down a wild hoss." Billy rubbed his bald head and thought and thought. With that orderliness which had become his habit of mind, from work with reports and papers, sorting and filing away, Billy went back to the beginning. Dan Barry was fleeing. He started from Rickert, and 9 chances out of 10 he was heading, eventually, toward those particularly impenetrable mountain ranges where the sheriff before had lost the trail after the escape from the cabin and the killing of Mat Henshaw. Towards this same region again he had retreated after the notorious killing at Alder. There was no doubt then, humanly speaking, that he would make for the same safe refuge. At first glance this seemed quite improbable, to be sure, for the Morgan Hills lay due east, or very nearly east, while the place from which Barry must have sallied forth and to which he would return was somewhere well north of west, and a good 40 miles away. It seemed strange that he would strike off in the opposite direction, so Billy closed his eyes, leaned back in his chair, and summoned up a picture of the country. 5 miles to the east the Morgan Hills rolled, sharply broken ups and downs of country. Badlands rather than real hills, and a difficult region to keep game in view. That very idea gave Billy his clue. Barry knew that he would be followed hard and fast, and he headed straight for the Morgans to throw the posse off the final direction he intended to take in his flight. In spite of the matchless speed of that black stallion of which the sheriff had learned so much, he would probably let the posse keep within easy view of him until he was deep within the Badlands. Then he would double sharply around and strike out in the true direction of his flight. Having reached this point in his deductions, Billy smote his hands together. He was trembling with excitement, so that he filled his pipe with difficulty. By the time it was drawing well, he was back examining his mental picture of the country. West of Rickert, about the same distance as Morgan Hills, ran the Wago Mountains, low, rolling ranges which would hardly form an impediment for a horseman. Across these Barry might cut at a good speed on his western course. But some 15 or 20 miles from Rickert he was bound to reach a most difficult barrier. It was the Asper River, at this season of the year swollen high and swift with snow water. A rare feat indeed if a man could swim his horse across such a stream. There were only 2 places in which it could be forded. About 50 miles north and a little east of the line from Rickert, the Asper spread out into a broad, shallow bed. Its streams dispersed for several miles into a number of channels, which united again further down the course, and made the same strong river. Towards this ford, therefore, it was possible that Dan Barry would head, in the region of Caswell City. There was, however, another way of crossing the stream. Almost due west of Rickert, a distance of 15 miles, Tucker Creek joined the Asper. Above the point of junction, both the creek and the river were readily fordable, and Barry could cross them and head straight for his goal. It was true that to make Tucker Creek he would have to double out of the Morgan Hills and brush back perilously close to Rickert, but Billy was convinced that this was the outlaw's plan. For though the Caswell City fords would be his safest route, it would take him a day's ride on an ordinary horse out of his way. Besides, the sheriff had always said, "Barry will play the chance." Billy would have ventured his life that the fugitive would strike straight for the creek as soon as he doubled out of the Morgan Hills. Doors began to bang. 100 pairs of boots thudded and jingled towards Billy. The noise of voices rolled through the outer hall, poured through the door, burst upon his ears. He looked up in mild surprise. The first wave of Rickart's men had swept out of the courthouse to take the trail of the fugitive or to watch the pursuit. In this second wave came the remnants, the old men, the women, great-eyed children. In spite of their noise of foot and voice, they appeared to be trying to walk stealthily, talk so softly. They leaned upon his desk and questioned him with gesticulations, but he only stared. They were all dim as dream people to Billy the clerk, whose mind was far away, struggling with his problem. "Poor old Billy is kind of dazed," suggested a woman. "Don't bother him, Bud. Look here." The tide of noise and faces broke on either side of the desk and swayed off towards the inner office, and vaguely Billy felt that they should not be there. The sheriff's privacy, the thought almost drew him back to complete consciousness. But he was borne off from them again on a wave of study. Pictures. Off there to the east went the 15 best men of the mountain desert, on the trail of the slender fellow with the black hair and the soft brown eyes. How he had seemed to shrink with aloofness, timidity, when he stood there at the door, giving his name. It was not modesty. Billy knew now. It was something akin to the beasts of prey who shrink from the eyes of men until they are mad with hunger, and in the slender man Billy remembered the same shrinking, the same hunger. When he struck, no wonder that even the sheriff went down. No wonder if even the 15 men were baffled on that trail. And therefore it was sufficiently insane for him, Billy the clerk, to sit in his office and dream with his ineffectual hands of stopping that resistless flight. Yet he pulled himself back to his problem. Considering his problem in general, the thing was perfectly simple. Barry was sure to head west, and to the west there were only 2 gates, fording the creek and the river above the junction in the first place, or, in the second place, cutting across the Asper far north at Caswell City. If he could be turned from the direction of Tucker Creek, he would head for the second possible crossing, and when he drew near Caswell City, if he were turned by force of numbers again, he would unquestionably skirt the Asper, hoping against hope that he might find a fordable place as he galloped south. But going south, he might be fenced again from Tucker Creek, and then his case would be hopeless and his horse worn down. It was a very clever plan, quite simple after it was once conceived, but in order to execute it properly it was necessary that the outlaw be pressed hard every inch of the way and never once allowed to get out of sight. He must be chased with relays. In ordinary stretches of the mountain desert that would have been impossible, but the country around Rickett was not ordinary. Between the Morgan Hills and Wago there were considerable stretches of excellent farmland, in the center of which little towns had grown up. Running north from the country seat there were St. Vincent, Wago, and Caswell City. Coming south again along the Asper River there were Ganton and Wilsonville. And just above the junction of the river with Tucker Creek lay the village of Bly Falls. There was no other spot in the mountain desert, perhaps, which could show so many communities. Also, it was possible to get in touch with the towns from Rickett, for in a wild spirit of enterprise telephones had been strung to connect each village of the group. His hand went out mechanically and pushed in an open drawer of his filing cabinet as if he were closing up the affair, putting away the details of the plan. Each point was now clear, orderly assembled. It meant simply chasing Barry along a course which covered close to 100 miles, and which lay in a loosely shaped U. St. Vincent's was the tip of the eastern side of that U. The men of St. Vincent's were to be called out to turn the outlaw out of his course towards Tucker Creek. And then, as he struck northeast towards Caswell City, they were to furnish the posse with 15 fresh horses, the best they could gather on such short notice. Swinging north along that side of the U, Wago would next be warned to get its contribution of 15 horses ready, and this fresh relay would send Barry thundering along towards Caswell City at full speed. Then Caswell City would send out its contingent of men and horses and turn the fugitive back from the fords. By this time, unless his horse were better winded than any Billy had ever dreamed of, it would be staggering at every stride, and the fresh horses from Caswell City would probably ride him down before he had gone 5 miles. Even in case they failed in this, there was the little town of Ganton, which would be ready with its men and mounts. Perhaps they could hem in the desperado from the front and shoot him down there as he skirted along the river. At the worst, they would furnish the fresh horses, and the 15 hardy riders would spur at full speed south along the river. If again, by some miracle, the black stallion lasted out this run, Wilsonville lay due ahead, and that place would again give new horses to the chase. Last of all, the men of Bly Falls could be warned. Bly Falls was a town of size, and it could turn out enough men to block a dozen Danburys, no matter how desperate. If he reached that point, he must turn back. The following posse would catch him from the rear, and between 2 fires he must die ingloriously. Taking the plan as a whole, it meant running Barry close to 100 miles with 6 sets of horses. It all hinged, however, on the first step. Could the men of St. Vincent turn him out of his western course and send him north towards Caswell City? If they could, he was no better than a dead man. All things favored Billy. In the first place, it was still morning, and 8 hours of broad daylight would keep the fugitive in view every inch of the way. In the second place, much of the distance was cut up by the barbed wire fences of the farmlands, and he must either jump these or else stop to cut them. A crackle of laughter cut in on Billy the clerk. They were laughing in that inner office where the sheriff lay dead. Blood swept across his eyes, set his brain whirling, and he rushed to the door. "You yelping coyotes!" shouted Billy the clerk. "Get out! I gotta be alone. Get out, or by God—" It was not so much his words or the fear of his threats, but the very fact that Billy the clerk, harmless, smiling old Billy, had burst into noisy wrath, scared them as if an earthquake had gripped the building. They went out sidling and left the rooms in quiet. Then Billy took up the phone. "Pete Glass is dead," he was saying a moment later to the owner of the general merchandise store at St. Vincent's. "Barry came in this morning and shot him. The boys have run him east to Morgan Hills. Johnny, listen hard and shut up. You got half an hour to turn out every man in your town. Ride south till you get in the hills on a bee line east of where Tucker Creek runs into the old Asper. You hear? Then keep your eyes peeled to the east and watch for a man on a black horse riding hard, because Barry is sure as hell going to double back out of the Morgan Hills and come west like a scared coyote. The posse will be behind him, but they'll most likely be a hell of a way to the bad. Johnny, everything hangs on your turning Barry back and have 15 fresh horses, the best St. Vincent has, so that the boys in the posse can climb on 'em and ride hell-bent for Wago. Johnny, if we get him started north, he's dead, and if you turn him like I say, I'll see that you come in on the reward. You hear?" But there was only an inarticulate whoop from the other end of the wire. Billy hung up. A little later, he was talking to Wago. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 30. The Morgan Hills. Once out of Rickert, Barry pulled the stallion back to an easy canter. He had camped during the latter part of the night near the town and ridden in the morning, so that Satan was full of running. He rebelled now against this easy pace and tossed his head with impatience. No curb restrained him, not even a bit. A light hackamore could not have held him for an instant, but the voice of the rider kept him in hand. Now, out of Rickert's one street came the thing for which Barry had waited and delayed his course, a scudding dust cloud. On the top of a rise of ground he brought Satan to a halt and looked back, though Black Bart ran in circles around him and whined anxiously. Bart knew that they should be running. There was no good in that ragged dust cloud. Finally he sat down on his haunches and looked his master in the face, quivering with eagerness. The posse came closer, at the rate of a racing horse, and near at hand the tufts of dust which tossed up above and behind the riders dissolved, and Whistling Dan made them out clearly, and more clearly. For one form he looked above all, a big man who rode somewhat slanting, but Vic Gregg was not among the crowd, and for the rest Barry had no wish to come within range of their harm. The revolver at his side, the rifle in its case, were for the seventh man who must die for Grey Molly. These who followed him mattered nothing, except that he must not come within their reach. He studied them calmly as they swept nearer. 15 chosen men, as he could tell by their riding, on 15 choice horses, as he could tell by their gait. If they pushed him into a corner, well, 5 men were odds indeed, yet he would not have given them a thought. 10 men made it a grim affair, but still he might have taken a chance. However, 15 men made a battle suicide. He simply must not let them corner him. Particularly 15 such men as these, for in the mountain desert where all men are raised gun in hand, these were the quickest and the surest marksmen. Each one of them had struck that elusive white ball in motion, and each had done it with a revolver. What could they do with a rifle? That thought might have sent him rushing Satan down the further slope, but instead he raised his head a little more and began to whistle softly to himself. Satan locked an ear back to listen. Black Bart rose with a muffled growl. The posse rode in clear view now, and at their head was a tall, lean man with the sun glinting now and again on his yellow mustaches. He threw out his arm, and the posse scattered towards the left. Obviously he was the accepted leader, and indeed few men in the mountain desert would not willingly have followed Mark Retherton. Another gesture from Retherton, and at once a dozen guns gleamed, and a dozen bullets whizzed perilously close to Barry. Then the reports came barking up to him. He was just a little out of range. Still he lingered for a moment before he turned Satan reluctantly, it seemed, and started him down the far slope, straight away for the Morgan Hills, as old Billy had prophesied. It would be no exercise canter even for Satan, for the horses which followed were rare of their kind, and the western horse at the worst has manifold fine points. His ancestor is the Barb, or the Arab, which the Spaniards brought with them to Mexico, and the descendants of that finest of equine bloods made up the wild herds which soon roamed the mountain desert to the north. Long famines of winter, hot deserts in summer changed their appearance. Their heads grew lumpier, their necks more scraggy, their crops more slanting, their legs shorter, but their hooves grew denser, harder, their shorter coupling gave them greater weight-carrying possibilities. The stout bones and clean lines of their legs meant speed, and above all, they kept the stout heart of the thoroughbred, and they gained more than this, an indomitable bulldog persistence. The cheapest western cowpony may look like a cartoon of a horse, but he has points which a judge will note, and he will run a picture horse to death in 3 days. Such were the horses which took the trail of Satan, and they were chosen specimens of their kind. Up the slope they stormed, and there went Satan skimming across the hollow beneath them. Their blood was his blood, their courage his courage, their endurance his endurance. The difference between them was the difference between the factory machine and the handmade work of art. From his pasterns to his withers, from his hooves to his crop, every muscle was perfectly designed and perfectly placed for speed, tireless running. Every bone was the maximum of lightness and strength combined. A feather bloom on a steady wind. Such was the gait of Satan. Down the hollow the posse thundered, and up the farther slope, and still the blacks slipped away from them, until Mark Retherton cursed deeply to himself. "Don't race your hosses, boys," he shouted. "Keep 'em in hand. That devil is playing with us." As a result, they checked their mounts to merely a fast gallop, and Barry, looking back, laughed softly with understanding. Far different the laborious pounding of the posse and the light stretch of Satan beneath him. He leaned a little until he could catch the sound of the breathing, big, steady draughts with comfortable intervals between. He could run like that all day, it seemed, and Whistling Dan ran his fingers luxuriously down the shining neck. Instantly the head tossed up, and a short whinny whipped back to him like a question. Just before them the Morgan Hills jutted up, like stiff mud chopped by the tread of giants. "Now, partner," murmured Barry, "show 'em what you can do. Just lengthen out a bit." The steady breeze from the running sharpened into a gale, whisking about his face. There was no longer the wave-like rock of that swinging gallop, but a smooth, swift succession of impulses. Rocks, shrubs darted past him, and he felt a gradual settling of the horse beneath him as the strides lengthened. From behind, a yell of dismay, and with a backward glance he saw every man of the posse leaning forward and swinging his quirt. An instant later, half a dozen of the ragged little hills closed between them. Once fairly into the heart of the Morgans, he called the stallion back from the racing stride to a long canter, and from the gallop to a rapid trot, for in this broken country it was wearing on an animal to maintain a lope uphill and down the quick, jerking falls. The cowpuncher hates the trot, for his ponies are not built for it. But the deep play of Satan's fetlock joints broke the hard impacts. His gait now was hardly more jarring than the flow of a single foot in an ordinary animal. Black Bart, who had been running directly under the nose of the stallion, now skirted away in the lead. Here and there he twisted among the gullies at a racing clip, his head high, and always he picked out the smoothest ground, the easiest rise, the gentlest descent which lay more or less straight in the line of his master's flight. It cut down the work of the stallion by half to have this swift, sure scout run before and point out the path, yet it was stiff labor at the best, and Barry was glad when he came on the hard gravel of an old creek bed cutting at right angles to his course. From the first he had intended to run towards the Morgans only to cover the true direction of his flight, and now, since the posse was hopelessly left behind him, well out of hearing, he rode Satan into the middle of the creek bed and swung him north. It was bad going for a horse carrying a rider, and even the cat-like certainty of Satan's tread could not avoid sharp edges here and there that might cut his hoofs, so Barry leaped to the ground and ran at full speed down the bed. Behind him Satan followed, his ears pricked uneasily, and Black Bart, at a signal from the master, dropped back and remained at the first bend of the old empty stream. In a moment they wound out of sight even of Bart, but Barry kept steadily on. It would take a magnifying glass to read his trail over these rocks. He had covered a mile, perhaps, when Bart came scurrying again and leaped joyously around the master. "They've hit the creek, huh?" said Whistling Dan. "Well, they'll mill around a while, and like as not they'll run a course south to pick me up again." He gestured toward the side, and as soon as Satan stood on the good going once more, Barry swung into the saddle and headed straight back west. No doubt the posse would ride up and down the creek bed until they found his trail turning back, but they would lose precious minutes picking it up. And in the meantime he would be far, far away towards the ford of Tucker Creek. Then, clearly, but no louder than the snapping of a dry twig near his ear, he heard the report of a revolver, and it spoke to him of many things as the baffled posse rode up and down the creek bed, hunting for the direction of his escape. Someone had fired that shot to relieve his anger. He neither spoke to Satan nor struck him, but there was a slight leaning forward, an imperceptible flexing of the leg muscles, and in response the black sprang again into the swift trot which sent him gliding over the ground and twisting back and forth among the sharp-sided gullies with a movement as smooth as the run of the wolf dog, which once again raced ahead. When they came out in view of the rolling plain, Barry stopped again and glanced to the west and the north, while Black Bart ran to the top of the nearest hill and looked back, an ever vigilant outpost. To the north lay the fordable streams near Caswell City, and that way was perfectly safe, it seemed. Not perfect, perhaps, for Barry knew nothing of the telephones by which the little bald-headed clerk at the sheriff's office was rousing the countryside, but if he struck toward Caswell City from the Morgans, there was not a chance in 10 that scouts could catch him at the river, which was fordable for mile after mile. That way, then, lay the easiest escape, but it meant a long detour out of the shortest course, which struck almost exactly west, skirting dangerously close to Rickett. But, as Billy had presupposed, it was the very danger which lured the fugitive. Behind him, entangled in the gullies of the Bad Lands, were the 15 best men of the mountain desert. In front of him lay nothing except the mind of Billy the clerk. But how could he know that? Once again he swayed a little forward, and this time the stallion swung at once into his ranging gallop, then verged into a half-racing gait, for Barry wished to get out of sight among the rolling ground, before the posse came out from the Morgan Hills on his back trail. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 31. The Trap. He had already covered a good 10 miles, and a large part of that through extremely rough going. But the black ran with his head as high as the moment he pulled out of Rickett that morning, and there was only enough sweat to make his slender neck and greyhound flanks flash in the sun. Back he winged toward Rickett, running as freely as the wild leader of a herd, sometimes turning his fine head to one side to look back at the master or gaze over the hills, sometimes slackening to a trot up a sharper ascent or lengthening into fuller gallop on an easy down slope. There seemed no purpose in the reins, which were kept just taut enough to give the rider the feel of his mount, and the left hand which held them was never still for a moment, but played back and forth slightly with the motion of the head. Except in times of crisis, those reins were not for the transmission of orders, it seemed, but they served as the wires through which the mind of the man and the mind of the horse kept in telegraphic touch. In the meantime, Black Bart loafed behind, lingering on the crest of each rise to look back, and then racing to catch up. But halfway back to Rickett he came up beside the master, whining and leaping as high as Barry's knee. "You've seen something?" queried Barry. "Are they coming on the trail again?" He swayed a bit to one side and diverted Satan out of his course so as to climb one of the more commanding swells. From this point he glanced back and saw a dust cloud, much like that which a small whirlwind picks up, rolling down the nearest slope of the Morgan Hills. At that distance the posse looked hardly larger than one unit, and certainly they could not see the single horseman they followed. However, they could follow the trail easily across this ground. Satan had turned to look back. "Shall we go back and play around 'em, boy?" asked Barry. Black Bart had run on ahead, and now he turned with a short howl. "The partner says no," continued the master. "Of all the dogs I ever see, Bart plays the most careful game. But out on the trail, Satan." Here he sent the stallion into a sweeping lope. "Bart knows more'n you and me put together, so we'll do what he says." For answer, Satan lengthened a little into his stride. As for the wolf dog, he went off like a black bolt into the eye of the wind, streaking it west to hunt out the easiest course. A wolf, and surely there was more of wolf than of dog in Black Bart, has a finer sense of the lay of ground than anything on 4 feet. He knows how to come down the wind on his quarry, keeping to the depressions and ravines so that not a taint of his presence is blown to the prey. And he will skulk across an open plain, stealing from hollow to hollow and stalking from bush to bush, so that the wariest are taken by surprise. As for Black Bart, he knew the kind of going which the stallion liked as well almost as he knew his own preferences, and he picked out a course which a surveyor with line and spirit level could hardly have bettered. He wove across the country in loosely thrown semicircles and came back in view of the master at the proper point. There was hardly much point in such industry in a country as smooth as this, not much more difference, say, than the saving of distance which the horse makes who hugs the fence on a turn and on account of that sticks his head under the finish wire a nose in front. And Bart clung to his work with scrupulous care. Sometimes he ran back with lolling red tongue when the course lay clear even to the duller sense of a human, and frisked under the nose of Satan until a word from Barry sent him scurrying away like a pleased child. His duties comprehended not only the selection of the course, but also an eagle vigilance before and behind, so that when he came again with the peculiar whine, Barry leaned a little from the saddle and spoke to him anxiously. "Do you mean to say that they're gaining ground on us, old boy?" Black Bart leaped sideways, keeping his head toward the master, and he howled in troubled fashion. "Whereaway are they now?" muttered Barry, and looked back again. A great distance behind, hardly distinguishable now, the dust of the posse was blending into the landscape and losing itself against a gray background. "If there's nothin' wrong behind, what's bitin' you, Bart? You gettin' hungry, maybe? Want to hurry home?" Another howl, still louder, answered him. "Go on, then, and show me where they's trouble." Black Bart whirled and darted off almost straight ahead, but bearing up a hill slightly south of their course. Toward the top of this eminence he changed his lope for a skulking trot that brought his belly fur trailing on the ground. "They's something ahead of us, Satan," cried the master softly. "What could that be? It's men, from the way Bart sneaks up to look at 'em. There's nothing else that he'd do that way for. Easy, boy, and go soft." The stallion cut his gallop into a slinking trot, his head lowered, even his ears flat back, and glided up the hillside. Barry swung to the ground and crawled to the top of the hill. What he saw was a dozen mounted men swinging down into the low, broad scoop of ground beyond the hill. They raced with their hat brims standing stiff up in the wind. "They've been watching us with glasses," whispered Dan to Bart, and the wolf dog snarled savagely, his neck fur ruffling up. The dozen directly in front were not all, for to the right, bearing straight across his original course, came another group almost as strong, and to the left 8 more riders spurred at top speed. "We almost walked into 'em," said Barry, "but they ain't got us yet. Back, boy." The wolf dog slunk down the hill until it was out of sight from the farther side of the slope, and the master imitated these tactics until he was close to Satan. Once in the saddle he made up his mind quickly. Someone in Rickett had guessed his intention to double back toward Tucker Creek, and they had cut him off cleverly enough and in overwhelming force. However, no one in Rickett could guess that another way out remained for him in the fords below Caswell City, and even if they knew, their knowledge would do them no good. They could not wing a message to that place to head him off. It was not humanly possible. For Dan knew nothing of the telephone lines which brought Caswell City itself within speaking distance of far-away Rickett. Caswell City, then, was his goal, but to get toward it he must circle far back toward the Morgan Hills, back almost into the teeth of the posse, in order to skirt around the right wing of these new enemies. Even then, to double that flank, he must send Satan ahead at full speed. As he swung around, the 8 men of that end party crashed over the hill 500 yards away, and their yell at the view of the quarry went echoing up the shallow valley. The slayer of Pete Glass, he who had done the notorious killing at Alder, was almost in touch of their revolvers, and their horses were fresh. Not one of that 8 but would have given odds on his chances of sharing the capture money. There were no spurs on the heels of Barry to urge Satan, and no quirt in his hand, but a single word sent the black streaking down the hill. Going into the Morgan Hills he had gone like the wind, but now he rushed like a thoroughbred, standing a challenge in the home stretch. His nose and his flying tail were a straight line, and the flash of his legs was a tangle which no eye could follow as he shot east on the back trail, straight toward the posse. For a mile or more that speed did not slacken, and at the end of that distance he began to edge to the right. The men behind him knew well enough what the plan of the fugitive was, and they angled further toward the north. There in the distance came the posse, the cloud of dust breaking up now into the dark figures of the 15, and if the men from St. Vincent could hold the pace a little longer, they would drive Barry between 2 fires. They flattened themselves along their horses' neck, at infinite risk to their necks in case of a stumble, and every spur in the crowd was dripping red. Horseflesh could do no more, and still the black drew ahead, inches and inches with every stride. If they could not turn him with their speed, another way remained, and by swift agreement the 4 best horses were sent ahead at full speed, while the other riders caught their reins over the pommels and jerked out their rifles. A quartet of bullets went screaming after the black horse. Indeed, there was little enough chance that a placed shot would go home, but their magazines were full, and a chance hit would do the work and kill both men and horse at that rate of speed. Dan Barry knew it, and when the bullets sang he whirled in the saddle and swept out his rifle from its case in the same moment. That yellow devil of anger flared in his eyes as he pitched the butt to his shoulder, and straight into the circle of the sight rode John Gasney of St. Vincent's. Another volley whistled about him as his finger trembled on the trigger. No chance work with Barry, for he knew the gait of Satan as a practised naval gunner knows the swing of his ship in a smooth sea, and that circle of doom wavered over Johnny Gasney for a dozen strides before Dan turned with a faint moan and jammed the rifle back in its case. Once again he was balancing in his stirrups, leaning close to cut the wind with his shoulders. "I can't do it, Satan. I got nothing agin 'em. They think they're playing square. I can't do it. Stretch out, old boy, stretch out." It seemed impossible that the stallion could increase his exertions, but with that low voice at his ear, he did literally stretch along the ground and jerked himself away from the pursuit, like a tall ship when the new sail spreads in a gale. The men from St. Vincent saw that the game was lost. Every one of the 8 had his rifle at the shoulder, and the bullets hissed everywhere about him. Right into his face, but a greater distance away, rode the posse from Rickett and the 15 tried men and true, and having caught the scheme of the trap, they were killing their horses with a last effort. It failed through no fault of theirs. Just as the jaws of the trap were about to close, the black stallion whisked out from danger, lunged over a swell of ground, and was out of view. When they reached that point, yelling, Barry raced his black out of range of all except the wildest chance shot. The 8 from St. Vincent drove their weapons sullenly into the holsters. For the last 5 minutes they had been silently dividing $10,000 by 8, and the awakening left a taste of ashes. They could only follow him now at a moderate pace in the hope of wearing him down, and since a slight pause made little difference in the result, it would even be an advantage to breathe their horses after that burst. They drew rein and cursed in chorus. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 32. Relays. The horses from St. Vincent already wheezed from the run, but the mounts of the posse were staggering, completely blown. Ever since they left Rickett, they had been going at close to top speed, and the last rush finished them. At least 7 of that chosen 15 would never be worth their salt again, and they stood with hanging heads, bloody foam upon their breasts and dripping from their mouths, their sides laboring and breathing with that rattle which the rider dreads. The posse, to a man, swung sullenly to the ground. "Who's boss, boys?" called Johnny Gasney, puffing in his saddle as he rode up. "By God, we'll get him yet. There's a devil in that black hoss. Who's boss?" "I ain't exactly boss," answered Mark Retherton, whom not even fear of death could hurry in his ways of speech. "But maybe I can talk for the boys. What you want, Johnny?" "You gents be needin' new hosses?" "We'll be needin' graves for the ones we got," growled Mark, and he stared gloomily at the dull eye of his pinto. "Best cuttin' out hoss I ever throwed a leg over, and now look at him." "Well, here's your relay," cut in Johnny Gasney. "Old Billy phoned down." 5 men came leading 3 spare horses apiece. "He phoned down and asked me to get 15 hosses ready. He must have guessed where Barry would head, and here they are, best ponies in St. Vincent, but by God, now use 'em better than you did that set." The other members of the posse set to work silently changing their saddles to the new relay, and Mark Retherton tossed his answer over his shoulder to Johnny Gasney while he drew his cinch brutally tight. "They's a pile of horseflesh in these parts, but they ain't more'n one Barry. You gents can say goodbye to your hosses, unless we nail him before they're run down." Johnny Gasney rubbed his red, fat forehead, perplexed. "It's all right," he decided, "'cause it ain't possible the black horse can outlast these, but he sure seemed full of running. One thing more, Mark, you don't need to fear pressin' Barry, because he won't shoot. He had his gun out, but I guess he don't want to run up his score any higher'n it is. He put it back without firing a shot. Go on, boys, and go like hell. Billy has lined up a new relay for you at Wago." They made no pause to start in a group, but each sent home the spurs as soon as he was in the saddle. They had ridden for the blood of Pete Glass before, but now at least 7 of them rode for the sake of the horses they had ruined, and to a cowpuncher a favorite mount is as dear as a friend. They expected to find the black out of sight, but it was a welcome surprise to see him not a half-mile away, wading across St. Vincent Creek. For Barry quite accurately guessed that there would be a pause in the pursuit after that hairbreadth escape, and at the creek he stopped to let Satan get his wind. He would not trust the stallion to drink, but gave him a bare mouthful from his hat and loosened the cinches for an instant. Not that this was absolutely necessary, for Satan was neither blown nor leg-weary. He stood dripping with sweat, indeed, but poised lightly, his head high, his ears pricked, his nostrils distended to transparency as he drew in great breaths. Even that interval Barry used, for he set to work vigorously massaging the muscles of shoulders and hips and wiping off the sweat from neck and flank. It was several moments, and already Satan's breath came easily, when Black Bart shot down from his watchpost and warned them on with a snarl. But still, before he tightened the cinches again and climbed to the saddle, Barry took the fine head of the stallion between his hands. "Between you and me, Satan," he murmured, "our day's work is just beginning. Are you feeling fit?" Satan nuzzled the shoulder of the master and snorted his answer. Black Bart had given the warning, and the stallion was eager to be off. They crossed the creek at a place where the stones came almost to the surface, since nothing is more detrimental to the speed of a horse than a plunge in cold water, and with the hoofbeats of the posse growing up behind, they cantered off again a little east of north, straight for Caswell City. There was little work for Black Bart in such country as this, for there was rarely a rise of ground over which a man on horseback could not look, and the surface was racetrack fast. Once Satan knew the direction, there was nothing for it but to sit the saddle and let him work, and he fell into his long-distance gait. It was a smart pace for any ordinary animal to follow through half a day's journey, and Barry knew with perfect certainty that there was not the slightest chance of even the fresh horses behind him wearing down Satan before night. But to his astonishment, the trailers rode as if they had limitless horseflesh at their command. Perhaps they were unaware of the running that was still in Satan, so Barry sent the stallion on at a free gallop that shunted the sagebrush past him in a dizzy whirl. A mile of this, but when he looked back, the posse were even closer. They were riding still with the spur. It was madness, but it was not his part to worry for them, and it was necessary that he maintain at least this interval, so he leaned a little forward to cut the wind more easily, and Satan leaped into a faster pace. He had several distinct advantages over the mounts of the posse. At their customary rolling lope, they will travel all day with hardly a break, but they have neither the size nor the length of leg for sustained bursts of speed. Moreover, most of the cowponies who now raced on the trail of Satan carried riders who outweighed Barry by 20 pounds, and in addition to this, they were burdened by saddles made ponderously to stand the strain of roping cattle, whereas Barry's specially made saddle was hardly half that weight. Perhaps more than all this, the cowponies rode by compulsion, urged with sharp spurs, checked and guided by the jaw-breaking curb, whereas Satan frolicked along at his own will, or at least at the will of a master who was one with his. No heavy bit worried his mouth, no pointed steel tormented his flanks. He had only one handicap, the weight of his rider, and that weight was balanced and distributed with the care of a perfect horseman. With all this in mind, it was hardly wonderful that the stallion kept the posse easily in play. His breathing was a trifle harder now, and perhaps there was not quite the same light spring in his gallop, but Barry, looking back, could tell by the tossing heads of the horses which followed that they were being quickly run down to the last gasp. Mile after mile there was not a pause in that murderous pace, and then, cutting the sky with a row of sharp-pointed roofs, he saw a town straight ahead, and groaned in understanding. It was rather new country to Barry, but the posse must know it like a book. They were spending their horses freely because they hoped to arrange for a fresh series of mounts in Wago. However, it would take time for them to arrange the details of a loan, and by that time he would be out of sight among the hills which stretched ahead. That would give him sufficient start, and he would make the fords near Caswell City comfortably ahead. At Caswell City, indeed, they might get a still other relay, but just beyond the Asper River rose the Grizzly Peaks, his own country, and once among them he could laugh the posse to scorn. He patted Satan on the shoulder and swept on at redoubled speed, skirting close to the town, while the posse plunged straight into it. Listening closely, he could hear their shouts as they entered the village, could mark the cessation of their hoofbeats. 10 minutes, 5 minutes at least for the change of horses, and that time would put him safely among the hills. But the impossible happened. There was no pause of minutes, hardly a pause of seconds, when the rush of hoofbeats began again and poured out from the town, 15 desperate riders on 15 fresh mounts. By some miracle, Wago had been warned, and the needed horses had been kept there saddled and ready for the relay. It turned an easy escape into a close chance. But still his faith in Satan was boundless to reach the fords in time and the safety of the mountains beyond. Another word, and with a snort the great-hearted stallion swept up the slope, with Black Bart at his old work, skirting ahead and choosing the easiest way. That was another great handicap in favor of the fugitive, and every advantage counted with redoubled significance now, every foot of distance saved, every inch of climb avoided. A new obstacle confronted him, for the low, rolling hills were everywhere checked with squares and oblongs of plowed ground, freshly turned and guarded by tall fences of barbed wire. They could be jumped, but jumping was no easy matter for a tiring horse, and Barry saw, with a sigh of relief, a sharp gulch to the left which cut straight through that region of broken farms and headed north and east, pointing like an arrow in the direction of the fords. He swung down into it without a thought and pressed on. The bottom was gravelly here and there from the effect of the waters, which had once washed through the ravine and cut these sides so straight. But over the greater part of the bottom sand had drifted, and the going was hardly worse than the hilly stretches above. The sides grew higher now with great rapidity. Already they were up to the shoulder of Satan, now up to his withers, and from behind the roar of the posse racing at full speed filled the gulch with confusion of echoes. They must be racing their horses as if they were entering the home stretch, as if they were sure of the goal. It was strange. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 33, The Jump. He brought Satan back to a hand canter, and so he pulled around the next curve of the gulch and saw the trap squarely in front. He came to a full halt, for he saw a tall, strong, barbed wire fence stretching across the stream bed, and beyond the fence were a litter of chicken coops, iron bands from broken barrels, and 1,000 other of those things which brand the typical western farmyard. Above the top of the bank to his left he caught a glimpse of the sharp roof of the house. He looked back, but it was far too late to turn, ride down the ravine to a place where the bank could be scaled, and cut across country once more. The posse came like a whirlwind, yelling, shooting, as if they hoped to attract attention, and attention they certainly won. For now Dan saw a tall, middle-aged fellow, his long beard blowing over one shoulder as he ran, come down into the farmyard with a double-barreled shotgun in his hands. He was a type of those who do not know what it is to miss their target, probably because ammunition comes so high, and with a double load of buckshot, it was literally death to come within his range. Dan knew that a great many chances may be taken against a revolver, and even a rifle can be tricked, but it is suicide to flirt with a shotgun in the hands of one used to bring down doves as they sloped out of the air toward a waterhole. The farmer stood with his broad-brimmed straw hat pushed far back on his head, looking up and down the ravine, a perfect target, and Barry's hand slipped automatically over his rifle. His fingers refused to close upon it. "I can't do it, Satan," he whispered. "We got to take our chances of getting by, that's all. He couldn't have no hand with Grey Molly." Narrow chances indeed by this time, for the brief pause had brought the posse fairly upon his heels. The farmer saw the fugitive and brought his shotgun to the ready, and Black Bart, in an agony of impatience, raced round and round the master. A wild cheer rose from the posse and came echoing about him. They had sighted their quarry. From Rickett to Morgan Hills, from Morgan Hills to St. Vincent, from St. Vincent to Wago, and far beyond, but this was the end of an historic run. "D'you see?" whispered Barry, leaning close to Satan's ears. "Lad, d'you see what you've got to do?" The black stood with his head very high, quivering through his whole body, while he eyed the fence. It was murderously high, and all things were against him, the long run, the rise of the ground going toward the fence, and the gravel from which he must take off for the jump. "You can do it," said the master. "You got to do it. Go for it, boy. We win or lose together." He swayed forward, and Satan leaped ahead at full speed, gathering impetus, scattering the gravel on either side. The farmer on the inside of the fence raised his shotgun leisurely to his shoulder and took a careful aim. He knew what it all meant. He had heard of the outlaw, Barry, with his black horse and his wolf dog. Everyone in the desert had, for that matter. And even had he been ignorant, the shouting of the posse which now raced down the canyon in full view would have told him all that he needed to know. How many things went through his mind while he squinted down the gleaming barrel? He thought of the long labor on the farm and the mortgage which still ate the life of his produce every year. He thought of the narrow bowed shoulders of his wife. He thought of the meager faces of his children. And he thought first and last of $10,000 reward. No wonder the hand which supported the barrels was steady as an iron prop. He was shooting for his life and the happiness of 5 souls. He would save his fire till he literally saw the white of the enemy's eyes, until the outlaw reached the fence. No horse on the mountain desert could top that high a strand of wire, as he very well knew. And in his youth, back in Kentucky, he had ridden hunters. That fence came exactly to the top of his head, and the top of his head was 6 feet and 2 inches from the ground. To make assurance doubly sure, he dropped upon one knee and made that shotgun an unstirring part and portion of himself. Nobly, nobly, the black came on, his ears pricking as he judged the great task, and his head carried a little high and back, as any good jumper knows his head must be carried. The practiced eye of the farmer watched the outlaw gather his horse under him. Well he knew the meaning of that shortening grip on the reins to give the horse the last little lift that might mean success or failure in the jump. Well he knew that rise in the stirrup, that leaning forward, and his heart rose in unison and went back to the bluegrass of Kentucky glittering in the sun. Before them went the wolf dog, skimming low, reached the fence and shot over it in a graceful high-arched curve. Then the shout of the rider, "Up! Up!" and the stallion reared and leaped. He seemed to graze it coming up, so close was his takeoff. He seemed to be pawing his way over with the forefeet, and then with both legs doubled close, hugging his body, he shot across and left the highest strand of the wire, quivering and humming. The farmer hurled his best shotgun a dozen yards away and threw up his hat. "Go it, lad! God bless ye, and good luck!" The hand of the rider lifted in mute acknowledgment, and as he shot past, the farmer caught a glimpse of a delicately handsome face that smiled down at him. "The left gate! The left gate!" he shouted through his cupped hands, and as the fugitive rushed through the upper gate, he turned to face the posse, which was already pulling up at the fence and drawing their wire cutters. As Barry shot out onto the higher ground on the other side of the farmhouse, he could see them severing the wires, and the interruption of the chase would be only a matter of seconds. But seconds counted triply now, and the halt and the time they would spend getting up impetus all told in favor of the fugitive. 35 miles or thereabouts since they left Rickett that morning, and still the black ran smoothly with a lilt to his gallop. Dan Barry lifted his head, and his whistling soared and pulsed and filled the air. It made Bart come back to him. It made Satan toss his head and glance at the master from the corner of his bright eye, for this was an assurance that the battle was over and the rest not far away. On they drove, straight as a bird flies for Caswell City, and Black Bart, ranging ahead among the hills, was picking the way once more. If the stallion was tired, he gave no sign of it. The sweep of his stride brushed him past rocks and shrubs, and he literally flowed uphill and down, far different from the horses which scampered in his rear, for they pounded the earth with their efforts, grunting under the weight of 50-pound saddles and heavy riders. Another handicap checked them, for while Satan ran on alone freely, the bunched pursuers kept a continual friction back and forth. The leaders reined in to keep back with the mass of the posse, and those in the rear, by dint of hard spurring, would rush up to the front in turn until some spirited nag challenged for the lead, so that there was a steady interplay among the 15. Their gait, at the best, could be no more than the pace of their slowest member, but even that pace was diminished by the difficulty of group riding. Yet Mark Retherton refused to allow his men to scatter and stretch out. He kept them in hand steadily, a bunched unit ready to strike together, for he had seen the dead body of Pete Glass, and he kept in mind a picture of what might happen if this fellow should whirl and pick off the posse man by man. Better prolong the run, for in the end no single horse could stand up against so many relays. Yet it was maddening to watch the stallion float over hill and dale with that same unbroken stride. Once and again he sent the fresh horses from Wago after the fugitive in a sprinting burst, but each time the black drifted further away, and mile after mile Mark Retherton pulled his field glasses to his eyes and strained his vision to make out some sign of labor in the gait of Satan. There was no change. His head was still high, the rhythm of his lope unfaltering. But here the Wago Mountains, not more than ragged hills to be sure, cut across the path of the outlaw, and in those hills, unless the message which waited for him at Wago had been false, should be the men of Caswell City, 20 or more, besides the 15 fresh horses for the posse. 20 of men at least Caswell could send out, and from the heights they could surely detect the coming of Barry and plant themselves in his way. An ambush, a volley, would end this famous ride. The hills came up on them swiftly now, and if the men of Caswell failed in their duty, it meant safety for the fugitive, because 2 miles beyond were the willows of the marshes and the fords across the Asper River. There could only be 2 alternatives, since not a man showed on the hills. Either they waited in ambush, or else they had mistaken the route along which Barry would come, and the latter was hardly possible. With his glasses, Mark Retherton scanned the hills anxiously, and it was then that he saw the dark form of the wolf dog skulking on before the outlaw. He had watched Black Bart before this, of course, but never with suspicion, until he noted the peculiar manner in which the animal skirted here and there through the rough ground, pausing on high places, weaving back and forth across the course of his master. Like a scout, thought Retherton. And by God, there he comes to report. For Black Bart had whirled and raced straight back for Dan. There was no need of howl or whine to give the reasons of his coming. The speed of his running meant business, and Barry shortened the pace of Satan while he looked over the hills, incredulous, despairing. It could not be that men lurked there to cut him off. No living thing could have raced from Rickert to Caswell City to warn them of his coming. Nevertheless, there came Bart with the ill tidings, and it only remained to skirt swiftly east, round the dangerous ground, and strike the marshes first. He swung Satan around on the new course with the pressure of his knees, and loosened him into a freer gallop. They must have sensed the meaning of this maneuver at once, for hardly had he stretched out east when voices shouted out of the hills, and around and over several low knolls came 40 horsemen racing. Half a dozen were already due east, no escape that way, and the long line of the others came straight at him with the slope of the ground to give them velocity. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 34. The Warning. All in a grim instant he saw the trap. It closed upon his consciousness with a click, and as he doubled Satan around he knew that the only escape was in running southeast along the banks of the Asper. Even that was a desperate, a forlorn chance, for if that omnipotent voice could reach from Rickett to Caswell City, 50 miles away, certainly it must have warned the river towns of Ganton and Wilsonville and Bly Falls, where Tucker Creek ran into the Asper. But this was no time for thinking. Already, looking back, he saw the posse changing their saddles to 15 fresh mounts, and he headed Satan across the Wago Hills, west and south. It was hot work. Even the steel wire muscles of Black Bart were weakening under the tremendous labors of that day, and as he scouted ahead his head was low and his red tongue lolled, and surest sign of all, the bushy tail drooped. Yet it was time to make a new call upon both wolf dog and horse, for the posse was racing after him as before, giving even the fresh, willing mounts the urge of spurs and quirts. His hand ran down the dripping neck and shoulders of Satan. He called to him, and with a snort the stallion responded. He felt the quiver as the muscles tightened for the work. He felt the settling as Satan lengthened to racing speed. Through the Wago Hills then, with Bart picking the way as before, and never a falter in the sweep of Satan's running. If his head was a little lower, if his ears lay flat, only the master knew the meaning, and still, when he spoke, the glistening ears pricked up, and they bounded on to a greater speed than before. The flight of a gull on unstirring wings when the wind buoys it, the glide of water over the descent of smooth rock, with never a ripple, like all things effortless, swift, and free, such was the gait of Satan as he fled. Let them spur the fresh horses from Caswell City till their flanks dripped red, they would never gain on him. On through the hills, and now the heave of his great breaths told of the strain, down like an arrow into the rolling ground, and now they galloped beside the Asper banks. The master looked darkly upon that water. 10 days before, when the snows had not yet reached the climax of melting, 10 days later, when that climax was overpassed, the Asper would have been fordable, but now a brown flood stormed along the gully, ate away the banks, undermined the willows here and there, and rolled stones larger than a man could lift. It went with an angry shouting, as if it defied the fugitive. It was narrow, maddeningly narrow, almost small enough to attempt a leap across to the safety of the thickets on the farther side, but the force of the water alone was enough to warn the bravest swimmer away, and here and there, like teeth in the mouth of a shark, jagged stones cut the surface, with white foam streaking out below them. As if to prove its power, even while Dan turned south along the bank, a dead trunk shot down the stream and split on one of Asper's teeth. Even then he felt the temptation. There lay the forest on the farther side, a forest which would shelter him, and above the forest, hardly a mile back, began the Grizzly Peaks. They lunged straight up to snowy summits, and all along their sides blue shadows of the afternoon drifted through a network of ravines, a promise of peace, a surety of safety if he could reach that labyrinth. He was almost glad when he left the mockery of the river's noise to turn aside for Ganton. There it lay in a bend of the Asper in the lowlands, and every town where men lived was an enemy. He could see them now gathered just outside the village, 20 men perhaps, and 15 spare horses, the best they had, for the posse. On past Ganton, and again a call upon Satan to meet the first spurt of the posse on its new horses. There was something in the stallion to answer, some incredible reserve of nerve, strength, and courage. There was a slight labor now, and something of the same heave and pitch which comes in the gait of a common horse. Also, when he put Satan up the first slope beyond Ganton, he noted a faltering, a deeper lowering of the head. When his hoofs struck a loose rock, he no longer had the easy recoil of the morning. He staggered like a graceful yacht chopped by a cross current. Now down the slope, now back to the roar of the Asper once more, for there the going was most level. But always the strides were shortening, and the head of the stallion nodded at his work. All that was seen by Mark Retherton through his glasses, though they were almost close enough now to see details through the naked eye. He turned in the saddle to the posse, grim faces, sweat and dust clotted in their mustaches, their faces drawn and gray with streaks over the nose and under the eyes where perspiration ran. They rode crookedly now, for 70 miles at full speed had racked them, twisted them, cramped their muscles. Scotty kept his head tilted far back, for his spinal column seemed about to snap. Walsh leaned to his right side, which a tormenting pain drew at every stride, and Hendricks cursed in gasps through a wry mouth. It had been an hour since Mark Retherton last spoke, and when he attempted it now, his voice was as hoarse as a croaking frog. "Boys, buck up. He's done. You see the black laborin'? You see it? Hey, Lou, Gary, we got the best hosses among us three. Now's the time for a spurt, and by God, we'll run him down. I'm startin'." He made his word good with an Indian yell and a wave of his hat that sent his buckskin leaping straight into the air, to land with stiff legs, swallowing its head. But then it straightened out in earnest. That buckskin had a name from Bly Falls to Caswell City, Speed and Courage, and it lived up to the record in the time of need. Close behind it came Lou and Gary, ponies scarcely slower than the buckskin, and they closed rapidly on Satan. The plan of Retherton was plain now that the black was running on its nerve. A spurt might bring them within striking distance, and if they could check the flight for an instant by opening advance guard fire, they might drive the fugitive into a corner by the river and hold him there until the main body of the posse came up. The three of them, running alone in the lead, could do 5 yards for every 4 of the slow horses, and the effect showed at once. Going up a slope, the trot of the stallion maintained or even increased his lead, but when they reached the easier ground beyond, they drew rapidly upon him. They saw Barry bend low. They saw the stallion increase its pace. "By God," shouted Retherton in involuntary admiration, "I'd rather have that horse than the 10,000. But feed him the spurs, boys, and he'll come back to us inside a mile." And Retherton was right. Before that mile was over, the black slipped back inch by inch, until at length Retherton called, "Now grab your guns, boys, and see if you can salt him down with lead. Give your horses their heads and turn loose." They pulled their guns to their shoulders and sent a volley at the outlaw. One bullet clipped a spark from the rocks just behind the stallion's feet. The other 2 must have gone wide. Once more Barry flinched closer over the neck of Satan, and once again the horse answered with a fresh burst of speed. But in a few moments he came back to them. Flesh could not stand that pace after 75 miles of running. They saw the rider straighten and look back. Then the sun flashed on his rifle. "Feed him the spur," shouted Retherton. "If we can't hit him shooting ahead, he ain't got a chance to hit us shooting backwards." For it is notoriously hard to turn in the saddle and accomplish anything with a rifle. One is moving away from the target instead of toward it, and every condition of ordinary shooting is reversed. Above all, the moment a man turns his head, he is completely out of touch with his horse. Apparently the fugitive knew this and made no attempt to place his shots. He merely jerked his gun to the shoulder and blazed away as soon as it was in place. Half a dozen yards in front of Retherton, the bullet kicked up the dust. "I told you," he shouted. "He can't do nothing that way. Close in, boys. Close in, for God's sake." He was himself flailing with his quirt, and the buckskin grunted at every strike. Once more the rifle pitched to the outlaw's shoulder, and this time the bullet clicked on a rock 10 feet from Retherton, and again on a straight line for him. "Damned if that ain't shooting," called Gary, and Retherton, alarmed, swung the buckskin out to one side to throw the marksman out of line. He had turned again in the saddle, and as though the episode were at an end, restored his rifle to the case. But when they poured in another volley about him, he swung sharply round about again, gun in hand. Once more the rifle went to his shoulder, and this time the bullet knocked a puff of dust into the very nostrils of the buckskin. Retherton reined in with an oath. "He's been warning me, boys," he called. "That devil has the range like he was sitting on a rocking chair shooting at a tin can. He's warning us back to the rest of the gang, and damned if we ain't going." It was quite patent that he was right, for 3 bullets sent on a line for 1 horse, and each of them closer, could mean only one thing. They checked their horses, and in a moment the rest of the posse was clattering around them. "It don't make no difference," called Retherton, "saving in time. Maybe he'll last to Wilsonville, but he can't stay in 3 miles when we hang on to him with fresh horses. The black is running on nothing but guts right now." End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 35. The Asper. 90 miles of ground at least had been covered by the black stallion since he left Rickett that morning. Yet when he galloped across the plain in full sight of Wilsonville, there were plenty of witnesses who vowed that Satan ran like a colt, frolicking over a pasture. Mark Retherton knew better, and the posse to a man felt the end was near. They changed saddles in a savage silence and went down the street out of town with a roar of racing hoofs. And Barry, too, as he watched them whip around the corner of the last house and streak across the fields, knew that the end of the ride was near. Strength, wind, and nerve were gone from Satan. His hoofs pounded the ground with the stamp of a plow horse. His breath came in wheezes, with a rattle toward the end. The tail no longer fluttered out straight behind. Yet when the master leaned and called, he found something in his great heart with which to answer. A ghost of his old buoyancy came in his stride. The drooping head rose, one ear quivered up, and he ran against the challenge of those fresh ponies from Wilsonville. There were men who doubted it when the tale was told, but Mark Retherton swore to the truth of it. Even then that desperate effort was failing. Not all the generous will in the heart of the stallion could give his legs the speed they needed, and he fell back by inches, by feet, by yards, toward the posse. They disdained their guns now, and kept them in the cases, for the game was theirs. And then they noted an odd activity in the fugitive, who had slipped to one side and was fumbling at his cinches. They could not understand for a time, but presently the saddle came loose, the cinches flipped out, and the whole apparatus crashed to the ground. Nor was this all. The rider leaned forward and his hands worked on the head of his mount until the hackamore also came free and was tossed aside. To that thing 15 good men and true swore the next day with strange oaths, and told how a man rode for his life on a horse that wore neither saddle nor bridle, but ran obediently to voice and hand. Every ounce counted, and there were other ounces to be spared. He was leaning again to this side and then that, and presently the posse rushed past the discarded riding boots. There lay the rifle in its case on the saddle far behind, and with the rifle remained all the fugitive's chances of fighting at long range. Now following came the heavy cartridge belt and the revolver with it. The very sombrero was torn from his head and thrown away. His horse was failing visibly. Not even this lightning could keep it away from the posse long, and yet the man threw away his sole chance of safety. And the 15 pursuers cursed solemnly as they saw the truth. He would run his horse to death and then die with it empty-handed, rather than let either of them fall a captive. Unburdened by saddle or gun or trapping, the stallion gave himself in the last effort. There ahead lay safety, if they could shake off this last relay of the posse, and for a time he pulled away until Retherton grew anxious, and once more the bullets went questing after the fugitive. But it was a dying effort. They gained, they drew away, and then they were only holding the posse even. And then once more they fell back gradually toward the pursuit. It was the end, and Barry sat bolt erect and looked around him, that this would be the last of him and the last scene he should see. There came the posse, distant but running closer. With every stride Satan staggered, with every stride his head drooped, and all the lilt of his running was gone. 10 minutes, 5 minutes more, and the 15 would be around him. He looked to the river which thundered there at his side. It was the very swiftest portion of all the Asper between Tucker Creek and Caswell City. Even at that moment, a few 100 yards away, a tall tree which had been undermined fell into the stream and dashed the spray high, yet even that fall was silent in the general roar of the river. checked by the body and the branches of the tree for an instant before it should be torn away from the bank and shot downstream, the waters boiled and left a comparatively smooth, swift-sliding current beyond the obstruction, and it gave to Barry a chance, or a ghost of a chance. The central portion of the riverbed was chopped with sharp rocks which tore the stream into white rages of foam, but beyond these rocks, a little past the middle, the tree like a dam smoothed out the current. It was still swift, but not torn with swirls or cross-currents, and in that triangle of comparatively still water of which the base was the fallen tree, the apex lay on a sandbar, jutting a few yards from the bank. And the forlorn hope of Barry was to swing the stallion a little distance away from the banks, run him with the last of his ebbing strength straight for the bank, and try to clear the rocky portion of the riverbed with a long leap that might, by the grace of God, shoot him into the comparatively protected current. Even then it would be a game only a tithe won, for the chances were 10-1 that before they could struggle close to the shore, the currents would suck them out toward the center. They would never reach that shelving bit of sand, but the sharp rocks of the stream would tear them a moment later like teeth. Yet the dimmest chance was a good chance now. He called Satan away from his course, and at the change of direction the stallion staggered, but went on, turned at another call, and headed straight for the stream. He was blind with running. He was numbed by the long horror of that effort, no doubt, but there was enough strength left in him to understand the master's mind. He tossed his head high, he flaunted out his tail, and sped with a ghost of his old sweeping gallop toward the bank. "Bart!" shouted the master, and waved his arm, and the wolf saw too. He seemed to cringe for a moment, and then, like some old leader of a pack who knows he is about to die and defies his death, he darted for the river and flung himself through the air. An instant later, Satan reared on the bank and shot into the air. Below him, the teeth of the rock seemed to lift up in hunger, and the white foam jumped to take him. The crest of the arc of his jump was past. He shot lower, and grazing the last of the stones, he plunged out of sight in the swift water beyond. There were 2 falls, not one, for even while the black was in the air, Barry slipped from his back and struck the water clear of Satan. They came up again struggling in the last effort toward the shore. The impetus of their leap had washed them well in toward the bank, but the currents dragged them out again toward the center of the stream where the rocks waited. Downriver they went, and Black Bart alone had a ghost of a chance for success. His leap had been farther, and he skimmed the surface when he struck, so that by dint of fierce swimming he hugged close to the shore, and then his claws bedded in the sandbank. As for Barry, the waters caught him and sent him spinning over and over like a log, whipping downstream, while the heavier body of Satan was struggling whole yards above. There was no chance for the master to reach the sandbank, and even if he reached it he could not cling. But the wolf dog knew many things about water. In the times of famine long years before the days of the master, there had been ways of catching fish. He edged forward until the water foamed about his shoulders. Down came Dan, his arms tumbling as he whirled, and on the sleeve of one of those arms the teeth of Bart closed. The cloth was stout, and yet it ripped as if it were rotten veiling, and the tug nearly swept Bart from his place. Still he clung. His teeth shifted their hold with the speed of light and closed over the arm of the master itself, slipped, sank deeper, drew blood, and held. Barry swung around, and a moment later stood with his feet buried firmly in the bank. He had not a moment to spare, for Satan, only his eyes and nose showing, rushed down the current, making his last fight. Barry thrust his feet deeper in the sand, leaned, buried both hands in the mane of the stallion. It was a far fiercer tug-of-war this time, for the ample body of the horse gave the water a greater surface to grapple on, yet the strength of the man sufficed. His back bowed, his shoulders ached with the strain, and then the 4 feet of Satan pawed the sand, and all three staggered up the shelving bank, reeled among the trees, and collapsed in safety. So great was the roar of the water that they heard neither shouts nor the reports of the guns, but for several minutes the bullets of the posse combed the shrubbery as high as the breast of a man. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 36. The Empty Cave. Through 10 months of the year, a child of 10 could wade the Asper, but now its deep roaring that set the ground quivering under Barry gave him perfect assurance of safety. Not one of that posse would attempt the crossing, he felt, but he slipped back through the shrubbery close to the bank to make sure. He was in time to see Mark Retherton give a command with gestures that sent reluctant guns into the holsters. Fists were brandished toward the green covert on the farther side of the river, so close, such an unreachable distance. One or two rode their horses down to the very edge of the water, but they gave up the thought, and the whole troop turned back toward Wilsonville. Even the horses were downheaded. Back in the covert, he found Bart lying with his head on his paws, his eyes closed, his sides swelling and closing till every rib seemed broken. Yet now and then he opened one red eye to look at Satan. The stallion lay in almost exactly the same position, and the rush and rattle of his breathing was audible even in the noise of the Asper. Barry dropped prone and pressed his ear against the left side of the horse, just behind the shoulder. The fierce vibration fairly shook his head. He could hear the rush of the blood, except when that deadly rattling of the breath came. When he rose to his knees, the face of the master was serious, thoughtful. "Satan," he called, but the river must have drowned his voice. Only when he passed his fingers down the wet neck, one of Satan's ears pricked and fell instantly back. It would not do to let him lie there in the cool mold by the water, for he knew that the greatest danger in overheating a horse is that it may cool too quickly afterward. He stooped directly in front of Satan and swept up an arm in command. It brought only a flicker of the eyelid which drooped over a glazing eye. "Up," he commanded. One ear again pricked. The head lifted barely clear of the ground. The forelegs stiffened with effort, trembled, and were still again. "Bart," shouted the master, "wake him up." The voice could not have carried to the wolf through the uproar of the waters, but the gesture, the expression brought home the order, and Black Bart came to his feet, staggering. Right against the nose of Satan he bared his great teeth, and his snarl rattled. No living creature could hear that sound without starting, and the head of Satan raised high. Still before him Bart growled, and under his elbow and his chest the hands of the master strained up. He swayed with a snort very like a human groan, struggled, the forelegs securing their purchase, and he came slowly to his feet. There he stood, braced and head low. A child might have caught him by the mane and toppled him upon his side, and already his hind legs were buckling. "Get on!" cried Barry. There was a lift of the head, a quivering of the tense nostrils, but that was all. He seemed to be dying on his feet when the master whistled. The sound cut through the rushing of the Asper as a ray of light probes a dark room, shrill, harsh, like the hissing of some incredible snake, and Satan went an uncertain step forward, reeled, almost fell, but the shoulder of the master was at his side, lifting up, and the arm of the master was under his chest, raising. He tried another step. He went on among the trees with his forelegs sprawling and his head drooped as though he were trying to crop grass. Black Bart did his part to recall that flagging spirit. Sometimes it was his snarl that startled the black. Sometimes he leaped, and his teeth clashed a hair's breadth from Satan's nose. By degrees the congealing blood flowed freely again through Satan's body. He no longer staggered, and now he lifted a forepaw and struck vaguely at Bart as the wolf dog leaped. Barry stepped away. "Bart," he called, and the shouting of the Asper was now so far away that he could be heard. Come around here, old boy, and stop bothering him. He's going to pull through." He leaned against a willow, his face suddenly old and white with something more than exhaustion, and laughed in such an oddly pitched, cracked tone that the wolf dog slunk to him on his belly and licked the dangling hand. He caught the scarred head of Bart and looked steadily down into the eyes of the wolf. "It was a close call, Bart. There wasn't more'n half an inch between Satan and—" The black turned his head and whinnied feebly. "Listen to him calling for help like a new-foaled colt," said the master, and went to Satan. The head of the stallion rested on his shoulder as they went slowly on. "Tonight," said the master, "you get 2 pieces of pone without asking." The cold nose of the jealous wolf dog thrust against his left hand. "You too, Bart. You showed us the way." The rattle had left the breathing of Satan. The stagger was gone from his walk. With each instant he grew perceptibly larger as they approached the border of the wood. It fell off to a scattering thicket, with the grizzly peaks stepping swiftly up to the sky. This was their magic instant in all the day, when the sun, grown low in the west, with bulging sides, gave the mountains a yellow light. They swelled up larger, with warm tints of gold rolling off into the blue of the canyons. At the foot of the nearest slope a thicket of quaking aspens was struck by a breeze and flashed all silver. Not many moments more, and all the peaks would be falling back into the evening. It seemed that Satan saw this, for he raised his head from the shoulder of the master and stopped to look. "Step on," commanded Barry. The stallion shook himself violently as a dog that knocks the water from his pelt, but he took no pace forward. "Satan!" The order made him sway forward, but he checked the movement. "I ask you man to man, Bart," said the master in sudden anger. "Was there ever a worse fool hoss than him? He won't budge till he get on his back." The wolf dog shoved his nose again into Barry's hand and growled. He seemed quite willing to go on alone with the master and leave Satan forgotten. "All right," said Barry. "Satan, are you coming?" The horse whinnied, but would not move. "Then stay here." He turned his back and walked resolutely across the meadow, but slowly and more slowly, until a ringing neigh made him stop and turn. Satan had not stirred from his first halting place, but now his head was high and his ears pricked anxiously. He pawed the ground in his impatience. "Look there, Bart," observed the master gloomily. "There's pride for you. He won't let on that he's too weak to carry me. Now I'd ought to let him stay there till he drops." He whistled suddenly, the call sliding up, breaking and rising again with a sharp appeal. Satan neighed again as it died away. "If that won't bring him, nothing will. Back we got to go. Bart, you just take this to heart. It ain't any use trying to bring 'em to reason that ain't got any sense." He went back and sprang lightly to the back of the horse, and Satan staggered a little under the weight, but once, as if to prove that his strength was more than equal to the task, he broke into a trot. A harsh order called him back to a walk, and so they started up into the Grizzly Peaks. By dark, however, a few halts, a chance to crop grass for a moment here and there, a roll by the next creek, and a short draught of water restored a great part of the black's strength, and before the night was an hour old he was heading up through the hills at a long, swift trot. Even then it was that dark, cold time just before dawn when they wound up the difficult pass toward the cave. The moon had gone down, a thin, high mist painted out the stars, and there were only varying degrees of blackness to show them the way, with peaks and ridges starting here and there out of the night, very suddenly. It was so dark, indeed, that sometimes Dan could not see where Bart skulked a little ahead, weaving among the boulders and picking the easiest way. But all 3 of them knew the course by instinct, and when they came to a more or less commanding rise of ground in the valley, Dan checked the stallion and whistled. Then he sat canting his head to one side to listen more intently. A rising wind brought him something like an echo of the sound, but otherwise there was no answer. "She ain't heard," muttered Dan to Bart, who came running back at the call, so familiar to him and to the horse. He whistled again, prolonging the call until it soared and trembled down the gulch, and this time when he stopped, he sat for a long moment waiting, until Black Bart whined at his side. "She ain't learned to sleep light yet," muttered Barry. "And I suppose she's plumb tired out waiting for me, but if something's happened, Satan!" That word sent the stallion leaping ahead at a racing gait, swerving among rocks which he could not see. "There's nothing wrong with her," whispered Barry to himself. "They can't be nothing happened to her." He was in the cave a moment later, standing in the center of the place with the torch high above his head. It flared and glimmered in the great eyes of Satan and the narrow eyes of Bart. At length he slipped down to a rock beside him while the torch, fallen from his hand, sputtered and whispered where it lay on the gravel. "She's gone," he said to emptiness. "She's left me." Black Bart licked his limp hand, but dared not even whine. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 37. Ben Swann. Since the night when old Joe Cumberland died and Kate Cumberland rode off after her wild man, Ben Swann, the foreman of the Cumberland ranch, had lived in the big house. He would have been vastly more comfortable in the bunkhouse, playing cards with the other hands, but Ben Swann felt vaguely that it was a shame for so much space in the ranch house to go to waste. And besides, Ben's natural dignity was at home in the place, even if his mind grew lonely. It was Ben Swann, therefore, who ran down and flung open the door on which a heavy hand was beating. Outside stood two men, very tall, taller than himself, and one of them a giant. They had about them a strong scent of horses. "Get a light," said one of these. "Run for it. Get a light. Start a fire and be damn quick about it." "And who the hell might you gents be?" queried Ben Swann, leaning against the side of the doorway to dicker. "Throw that fool on his head," said one of the strangers, "and go on in, Lee." "Stand aside," said the other, and swept the doorknob out of Ben's grip, flattening Ben himself against the wall. While he struggled there, gasping, a man and a woman slipped past him. "Tell him who we are," said the woman's voice. "We'll go in the living room, Buck, and start a fire." The strangers apparently knew their way even in the dark, for presently he heard the scraping of wood on the hearth in the living room. It bewildered Ben Swann. It was dreamlike, this sudden invasion. "Now who the devil are you?" A match was scratched and held under his very nose, until Ben shrank back for fear that his splendid mustaches might ignite. He found himself confronted by one of the largest men he had ever seen, a leonine face vaguely familiar. "You Lee Haines," he gasped. "What are you doing here?" "You're Swann, the foreman, aren't you?" said Haines. "Well, come out of your dream, man. The owner of the ranch is in the living room." Joe Cumberland's dead," stammered Ben Swann. "Kate Cumberland." "Her and Barry, the killing at Alder." "Shut up," ordered Haines, and his face grew ugly. "Don't let that chatter get to Kate's ears. Barry ain't with her, only his kid. Now stir about." After the first surprise was over, Ben Swann did very well. He found the fire already started in the living room, and on the rug before the hearth a yellow-haired little girl wrapped in a tawny hide. She was sound asleep, worn out by the long ride, and she seemed to Ben Swann a very pretty picture. Surely there could be in her little of the father of whom he had heard so much, of whom that story of the killing at Alder was lately told. He took in that picture at a glance and then went to rustle food. Afterward he went down to sleep in the bunkhouse, and at breakfast he recounted the events of the night with a relish. Not one of the men had been more than 3 years on the place, and therefore their minds were clean slates on which Swann could write his own impressions. "Appearances is deceivin'," concluded the foreman. "Look at Mrs. Dan Barry. They tell you about these parts that she's pretty. They don't tell you how damn fine lookin' she is."
and she's got a soft look, and you'd never pick her for the sort that would run clean off with a gent like Barry. Now, Barry himself wasn't so bad for looks, but they'll tell you in Elkhead how bad he is in action, and maybe they's some widders in Alder that could put in a word. Now, take even the kid. She looks no more'n a baby, but what do you know is inside of her? Speaking personal, gents, I don't put no kind of trust in that houseful yonder. Here they come in the middle of the night like there was a posse after 'em. They climb that house and sit down and eat like they'd ridden all day. Maybe they had. Even while they was eating, they didn't seem none too happy. That loose shutter upstairs come round in the wind with a bang, and Gus Daniels jumped out of his chair as fast as powder could blow him. Now, he didn't say nothing, just sat down looking kind of sick, and the other two was the same way. When they talked, they'd bust off in the middle of a word and let their eyes go trailing into some corner of the room that was plumb full of shadow. Then Lee Haines gets up and walks up and down. "Swan," says he, "how many good men have you got on the place?" "Why," says I, "they're all good." "Huh," says Haines. He puts a hand on my shoulder. "Just how good are they, Swan?" I seen what he wanted. He wanted to know how many scrappy gents was punching cows here. Maybe them three up there figures that they might need help. For what? What was they running away from?
"Hey!" broke in one of the cowpunchers, pointing with a dramatic fork through the window. It was a bright spot of gold that disappeared over the top of the nearest hill. Then it came into view again, the whole body of a yellow-haired child, clothed in a wisp of white and running steadily toward the north.
"The kid!" gasped the foreman. "Boys, grab her. No, you'll bust her. I know how to handle her."
He was gone through the door with gigantic leaps and shot over the crest of the low hill. Then those in the cookhouse heard a small, tingling scream. After it came silence and the tall foreman striding across the hill with the child high in his arms. He came panting through the door and stood her up on one end of the table, a small and fearless creature. She wore on her feet the little moccasins which Dan himself had fashioned for her. But the tawny hide was not on her. Perhaps her mother had thrown the garment away. The moccasins and the white nightgown were the sum and substance of her apparel, and the cowpunchers stood up around the table to admire her spunk.
"Damn near spat pison," observed Ben Swann, "when I hung into her. Tried to bite me, but the minute I got her in my hand she quit struggling, as reasonable as a grown-up, by God."
"Shut up, Ben. Don't you know no better than to cuss in front of a kid?" The great dark eyes of Joan went somberly from face to face. If she was afraid, she disguised it well. But now and then, like a wild thing which sees that escape is impossible, she looked through the window and out over the open country beyond.
"Where was you headed for, honey?"
queried Ben Swann. The child considered him bravely for a time before she replied.
"Over there." Now, what might she mean by that? Headed for Elkhead in a nightgown? Any place I could take you, kid?
If she did not altogether trust Ben Swann, at least she preferred him to the other unshaven, work-thinned faces which leered at her around the table.
"Daddy Dan," she said softly. "Joan wants to go to Daddy Dan." "Daddy Dan, Dan Barry," translated Ben Swann, and he drew a bit away from her. "Boys, that man-killing devil must be round here. And that's what them up to the house was running from, Barry."
It scattered the others to the windows, to the door.
"What'd you see?"
"Nothing."
"Swan, if Barry's comin' these parts, I'm gonna pack my war bag."
"Me too, Ben. Them as get 10,000'll earn it. I heard about the killing at Alder."
"Listen to me, gents,"
observed Ben Swann.
"If Barry is comin' here, we ain't none of us gonna stay, but don't start jumpin' out from under till I get the straight of it. I'm gonna take the kid up to the house right now and find out."
So he wrapped up Joan in an old blanket, for she was shivering in the cold of the early morning, and carried her up to the ranch house. The alarm had already been given. He saw Buck Daniels gallop toward the front of the place, leading 2 saddle horses. He saw Haines and Kate run down the steps to meet them, and then they caught sight of the foreman coming with Joan on his shoulder. The joy of that meeting, it seemed to Ben Swann, was decidedly one-sided. Kate ran to Joan with a little wailing cry of happiness and gathered her close, but neither big Lee Haines nor ugly Buck Daniels seemed overcome with happiness at the regaining of Joan, and the child herself merely endured the caresses of her mother. Ben Swann made them a speech. He told them that anybody with half an eye could tell they were bothered by something, that they acted as if they were running away. Now, running in itself was perfectly all right and quite in order when it was impossible to outface or outbluff a danger. He himself, Ben Swann, believed in such tactics. He wasn't a soldier, he was a cowpuncher. So were the rest of the boys out yonder, and though they'd stay by their work in ordinary times and they'd face ordinary trouble, they were not minded to abide the coming of Dan Barry.
"So," concluded Swann, "I want to ask you straight. Is him they call Whistling Dan coming this way? Are you running from him? And did you steal a kid from him?"
Lee Haines took upon his competent shoulders the duty of answering.
"Do you look like a sensible man, Swann?" he said severely. "I'm surprised at you. In the first place, 2 men don't run away from one."
A fleeting smile appeared and disappeared on the lips of Ben Swann. Haines hastily went on.
"As for stealing the baby from Dan Barry, good heavens, man, don't you think a mother has a right to her own child? Now go back to that scared bunch and tell them that Dan Barry is back in the Grizzly Peaks."
For several reasons this did not completely satisfy the foreman, but he postponed his decision. Lee Haines spoke like one in the habit of giving orders, and Swann walked slowly back to the cookhouse. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 38. The New Alliance.
"And so," said Lee Haines when he joined Buck Daniels in the living room, "there goes our reinforcements. That whole crew will scatter like dead leaves when Barry breezes in. It looks to me—"
"Shut up," cut in Daniels. "Shut up." His dark, homely face turned to the larger man with a singular expression of awe. He whispered,
"D'you hear? She's in the next room whipping Joan for running away, and never a yap out of the kid."
He held up a lean finger for caution, and then Haines heard the sound of the willow switch. It stopped.
"If you run away again," warned Kate, her voice pitched high and trembling, "Munner will whip harder and put you in a dark place for a long, long time."
Still there was not a sound of the child's voice, not even the pulse of stifled weeping. Presently the door opened, and Kate stood there.
"Go out in the kitchen and tell Li to give you breakfast. Naughty girls can't eat with Munner."
Through the door came Joan, her little round face perfectly white, perfectly expressionless. She did not cringe passing her mother. She walked steadily across the room, rose on tiptoe to open the kitchen door, and disappeared through it. Kate dropped into a chair, shaking.
"Out," whispered Buck to Lee Haines. "Beat it. I got to talk alone."
And as soon as Haines obeyed, Buck sat down close to the girl. She was twisting and untangling her fingers in a dumb agony.
"What has he done to her, Buck? What has he done?"
It was a maxim with Buck that talk is to women what swearing is to man. It is a safety valve, and therefore he waited in silence until the first rush of her grief had passed.
"She only looked at me when I whipped her. My heart turned in me. She didn't cry. She wasn't even angry. She just stood there, my baby, and looked at me."
She threw herself back in the chair with her eyes closed, and he saw where the trouble had marked her face. He wanted to lean over and take her in his arms.
"I'm going mad, Buck. I can't stand it. How could he have changed her to this?"
"Listen to me, Kate.
Joan ain't been changed. She's only showing what she is." The mother stared wildly at him. "Don't look at me like I was a murderer. God knows I'm sorry, Kate, but if they's Dan's blood in your little girl, it ain't my fault. It ain't anything he's taught her. It's just that being alone with him has brought out what she really is."
"I won't believe you, Buck. I don't dare listen to you."
"You got to listen, Kate, because you know I'm right. Do you think any kind of teaching could make her learn how to stand and keep from crying when she was whipped?"
"I know." She spoke softly, as if some terrible power might overhear them talk, and Buck lowered his voice in turn.
"She's wild, Kate. I knew it when I seen the way she handled Bart. She's wild."
"Then I'll have her tame again."
"You tried that once and failed."
Dan was a man when I tried, and his nature was formed. Joan is only a baby, my baby. She's half mine. She has my hair and my eyes."
"I don't care what the color of her eyes is. I know what's behind 'em. Look at 'em, and then tell me who she takes after."
"Buck, why do you talk like this? What do you want me to do?"
"A hard thing. Send Joan back to Dan."
"Never."
"He'll never give her up, I tell you."
"Oh, God help me. What shall I do? I'll keep her. I'll make her tame."
"But you'll never keep her that way. Think of Dan. Think of the yeller in his eyes, Kate."
"Until I die," she said with sudden quiet, "I'll fight to keep her."
And he answered with equal solemnity,
"Until Dan dies, he'll fight to have her, and he's never been beat yet."
Through a breathing space he stared at her and she at him, and the eyes of Buck Daniels were the first to turn. Everything that was womanly and gentle had died from her face, and in its stead was something which made Buck rise and wander from the room. He found Lee Haines and told him briefly all that had passed. The great battle, they decided, had begun between Kate and Barry for the sake of the child, and that battle would go on until one of them was dead or the prize for which they struggled lost. Barry would come on the trail and find them at the ranch, and then he would strike for Joan. And they had no help for the struggle against him. The cowpunchers would scatter at the first sign of Barry, at the first shrill of his ill-omened whistling. They might ride for Elkhead and raise a posse from among the citizens, but it would take 2 days to do that and gather a number of effective fighters for the crisis. And in the meantime, the chances were large that Barry would strike the ranch while the messenger was away. There was really nothing to do but sit patiently and wait. They were both brave men, very, and they were both not unpracticed fighters, but they began to wait for the coming of Barry as the prisoner waits for the day of his execution. It spoke well of the quality of their nerves that they would not speak to Kate of the time to come. They sat back like spectators at a play and watched the maneuvers of the mother to win back Joan. There was not an idle moment from breakfast to dark. They went out to gather wildflowers on the western hill from the house. They sat on the veranda where Kate told Joan stories of the ranch, and pointed out the distant mountains which were its boundaries, and explained that all between them would one day be her own land, and that the men who rode yonder were doing her work, that the cattle who ranged the hills were marked with her brand. She said it all in small words so that Joan could understand. But as far as Buck and Lee could make out, there was never a flicker of intelligence or interest in the eyes of the child. It was a hard battle every hour, and after supper Kate sat in a big chair by the fire with her eyes half closed, admitting defeat, perhaps. For Joan was curled up on the couch at the farthest, dimmest end of the room, and with her chin propped in both small hands, she stared in silence through the window and over the darkening hills. Buck and Lee were there, never speaking, but now and then their eyes sought each other with a vague hope. for Kate might see that her task was impossible, send Joan back, and that would free them of the danger. But where Kate left off, chance took up the battle and turned the scales. Old Li, the Chinese cook, had not seen Kate for 6 long years, and now he celebrated the return by hanging about her on 1,000 pretexts. It was just after he had brought in some delicacy from the kitchen, leaving the door a little ajar, when a small ball of gray fur nosed its way through the aperture and came straight for the glare of the fire on the hearth. It was a small shepherd puppy, and having observed the faces of the men with bright, unafraid eyes, it went wobbling on to the very hearth, sniffling. Even at that age it knew enough to keep away from the bright coals of wood, but how could it know that the dark, cold-looking andiron had been heated to the danger point by the fire? It thrust out a tentative nose, touched the iron, and then its shrill yelp of pain went startlingly through the room. It pulled the 3 grown-ups out of their thoughts and brought Joan scampering across the room with a little happy cry. The puppy would have escaped if it could, for it had in mind the dark, warm, familiar corner in Li's kitchen, where no harm ever came near. But the agile hands of Joan caught him. He was swept into her arms. That little wail of helpless pain, the soft fluff of fur against her cheek, wiped all other things from Joan's mind. Out the window and across the gloomy hills she had been staring at the picture of the cave, and the bright-eyed Satan, and the shadowy form of Bart, and the swift, gentle hand of Daddy Dan. But the cry of the puppy blotted the picture out. She was no longer lonely, having this small, soft body to protect. There sat her mother, leaning a little toward her with a glance at once misted and bright, and she forgot forthwith all the agency of Kate in carrying her away from that cave of delight.
"Look, Munner, he's burned his nose."
The puppy was licking the injured nose industriously and whimpering the while, and Joan heard no answer from her mother except an inarticulate little sound somewhere deep in Kate's throat. Over her child mind, vaguely like all baby memories, moved a recollection of the same sound, coming deeply from the throat of the mother and marvelously soothing, reassuring. It moved a fiber of trust and sympathy in Joan, an emotion as real as the sound of music, and with the puppy held idly in her arms for a moment, she looked curiously into Kate's face. On her own, a faint smile began in the eyes and spread to the lips.
"Poor little puppy, Munner,"
said Joan. The hands of Kate trembled with desire to bring Joan closer to her, but very wisely she merely stroked the cringing head of the dog. "Poor little puppy," she echoed. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 39. Victory. The entrance of the puppy, to liken small things to great, was the coming of Blucher in Kate's life, for the battle turned, and all in 5 minutes she had gone from defeat to victory. She sat by the fire with Joan sleeping in her arms, and the puppy in turn in the arms of Joan. It was such a foolish trick of chance that had given her all this. She was almost inclined to laugh, but something of tragedy in the faces of Buck and Lee Haines made her thoroughly serious. And she readily saw the truth, for after all a child's brain is a small affair. It holds so much and no more. One instant the longing for Dan was all that Joan could think of. The next she had no room for anything more than the burned nose of the puppy. And there were other phases to this matter, such as Buck Daniels had pointed out. Fear that in some future crisis the blood of the father might show in the child. Kate pushed those thoughts away. She was too full of the present happiness. Now, while she sat there in the firelight, She sang softly into the dreams of Joan, and watched the smile of sleep grow and wane faintly on the lips of the child as the rhythm of her singing lifted and fell. One half of her mind was empty, that part where Dan should have been, and a dozen times she checked an impulse to turn to him in the place where he should be sitting, and invite him with a smile to share her happiness. When her eyes moved they only fell on the gaunt, intent face of Buck or the leonine head of Haines. Whistling Dan was gone, and if he ever came again, her fear of him, her fear for Joan, would be greater than her love. Yet Dan being gone so finally, she knew that she would never be truly happy again. Her spring of life was ended. But even now she was grateful for the full richness of those 6 years with Dan. And if she turned from him now, it was only because a mighty instinct commanded her and a voice without words drove her. Joan must go on to a normal, womanly happiness. Dan Barry lived from day to day, glutting himself with a ride in the wind, or the whistle of a far-off bird, or the wail of a mountain lion through the night. Each instant was to him complete. But the eye of Kate looked far away and saw the night when this daughter of hers should sit holding an infant by such a fire, and her heart was both empty and full. It was no wonder, then, that she heard the first sound long before either Haines or Buck Daniels, for her mind was on guard against dangers which might threaten her baby. It was a faint slipping, scratching noise on the veranda, then a breathing at the front door. Kate turned, and the men followed the terror of her eyes in time to see the door fall open and a broad paw appear in the interval. The snaky head of Black Bart thrust into the room. Without a word, Daniels drew his gun. "Wait!" commanded Kate. Joan awoke with a start at the sharpness of this voice. "Don't shoot, Buck. See that bit of paper under his throat? He's bringing a message." "Bart!" cried Joan, slipping to the floor from her mother's lap. But when she ran toward the wolf dog, that tremendous snarl of warning stopped her short. Bart slunk toward Kate. "Look out, Kate!" cried Haines. "The black devil means murder." "Don't move or he'll go at your throat," she answered. "There's no danger to me. He's been ordered to go to me, and he won't let even Joan touch him. See?" He had glided past the amazed, outstretched arms of Joan and went straight to Kate and stopped beside her, obviously expectant. She reached for the slip of folded paper, and as her hand approached, he crouched a little, growling, but it was only to caution her, apparently, and though he distrusted the hand, he allowed it to unfasten the missive. She untwisted the note. She read aloud: "Kate, send Joan back to me, or I come for her. Send her with Bart." It seemed as though the wolf dog understood the written words, for now he moved toward Joan, and she, with a cry, dropped the squealing puppy and caught the great head of Bart in her arms. The puppy wailed, sitting down on his haunches and quivering with grief. "Daddy Dan wants me," explained Joan with bright eyes. "He sent for me. Go, quick, Bart." The big animal lay down to facilitate her mounting. "Joan!" called Kate. The child hesitated and turned toward her. Her mother had taken up that light revolver which Dan had taught her to use so well, and now, as she leveled it at the wolf dog, Bart laid his fangs bare in silent hate. The weapons of Buck and Lee Haines were ready, and now Bart raised himself a little and commenced to drag gradually forward to leaping distance. "Drop your gun, Kate," cautioned Buck. "For God's sake, drop your gun. Even if you hit him with a bullet, he'll be at your throat. Unless you kill him with the first shot, he'll have you. Drop your gun, and then he'll go at us." But Joan knew perfectly well what those gleaming bits of metal meant. She had seen Daddy Dan shoot and kill, and now she ran screaming between Bart and danger. "Mother!" she cried. "You bad, bad men! I won't let you hurt Bart." "They won't hurt you, Bart," explained Joan, taming much mollified to the great wolf dog. "They just playin'. Now we'll go." And she started toward the door, with Bart slinking in front and keeping a watchful lookout from a corner of his eye. "Are you going to leave the poor little puppy, Joan?" said the mother, keeping her voice steady, for all the force of the two men could not help her now. It rested with her wit. "I'll take him with me," answered Joan, and caught up the howling puppy from the floor. His wails died out against her breast. "But you mustn't do that, honey. He'll die in this cold night wind long before you get there." "Oh," sighed Joan, and considered her mother with great eyes. Black Bart turned and uneasily tugged at her dress. "Will you take good care of him, munner, till I come back?" "But I don't know how to take care of him, dear. If you go he'll cry and cry and cry until he dies." Joan sighed. "See how quiet he is when you hold him, Joan?" "Oh," muttered Joan again. The distress of the problem made her wrinkle her forehead. She turned to Kate for help. "Munner, what'll I do?" "You'd best stay here until the puppy is strong enough to go with you." She kept her voice well under control. It would not do to show the slightest emotion. And now she sat down and half turned away from the child. With her eyes she flashed a signal at the two troubled men, and they followed her lead. Their center of vision was now upon the fire. It left Joan, to all appearances, quite out of notice. "Oh, that'll be a long, long time, munner." "Only a little while, Joan." "But Daddy Dan'll be lonesome up there." "He has Satan and Bart to keep him company." "Don't you think he wants Joan, munner?" "Not as much as the poor little puppy wants you, Joan," she added, with just the slightest tremor. "You decide for yourself, Joan. Go if you think it is best." "Bart, what'll Joan do?" queried the child, turning in dismay toward the wolf dog. But as soon as he saw the puppy in her arms, he greeted her with a murderous snarl. "You see," suggested her mother, "that Black Bart would eat up the poor little puppy if you went now with him." At this alarming thought, Joan shrank away from Bart, and when he followed her anxiously, she cried, "Go away! Bad dog! Bad Bart!" He caught the edge of her dress and drew back toward the door, and this threw Joan into a sudden panic. She struck Bart across his wrinkled forehead. "Go away!" He slunk back, snarling at the puppy. "Go back to Daddy Dan." Then, as he pricked his ears, still growling like distant thunder, "Go tell Daddy Dan that Joan has to stay here a while." "Munner, how long?" "Maybe a week, dear." "A whole week?" she cried, dismayed. "Perhaps only 1 or 2 or 3 days," said Kate. Some of her tenseness was leaving as she saw victory once more inclining to her standards. 1, 2, 5 days," counted Joan. "And then come for me again. Tell Daddy Dan that, Bart." His eyes left her and wandered around the room, lingering for a vicious instant on the face of each. Then he backed toward the door. "He's clear of Joan now, Kate," whispered Buck. "Let me shoot." "No, no, don't even look at him." Then, with a scratching of sudden claws, Bart whirled at the door and was gone like a bolt down the hall. Afterwards, for a time, there was no sound in the room except the murmurings of Joan to her puppy. And then they heard the most mournful of sounds on the mountain desert, the long howl of a wolf which has missed its kill and hunts hungry on a new trail. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 40. The Failure. When Black Bart returned without Joan, without even a note of answer about his neck, the master made ready to take by force. First he went over his new outfit of saddle and guns, looking to every strap of the former, and the latter, revolvers and rifle, he weighed and balanced with a meditative look, as if he were memorizing their qualities against a time of need. With Satan saddled and Bart on guard at the mouth of the cave, he gathered up all the accumulation of odds and ends, provisions, skins, and made a stirring bonfire in the middle of the gravel floor. It was like burning his bridges before starting out to the battle. He turned his back to the cave and started on his journey. He had to travel in a loose semicircle, for there were 2 points which he must reach on the ride: the town of Alder, where lived the 7th man who must die for Grey Molly, and the Cumberland Ranch, last of all, where he would take Joan. Very early after his start, he reached the plateau where he had lived all those years with Kate, and he found it already sinking back to ruin, with nothing in the corrals, and the front door swinging to and fro idly in the wind, just as Joan had often played with it. Inside, he knew, the rooms were empty. A current of air down the chimney had scattered the ashes from the hearth all about the living room. Here must be a chair overturned, and there the sand had drifted through the open door. All this he saw clearly enough with his mind's eye, and urged Satan forward, for a chill like the falling of sudden night had swept over him, and he shrugged his shoulders with relief when he swept past the house. Yet when he came to the long downslope which pitched into the valley so far below him, he called Satan to a halt again and swung to look at the house. He could hear the clatter of the front door as it swung. It seemed to be waving a farewell to him. It was all the work of a moment, to ride back, gather a quantity of paper and readily inflammable materials, soak them in oil, and scratch a match. The flames swept up the sides of the logs and caught on the ceiling first of all, and Dan Barry stood in the center of the room until the terrified whining of Black Bart and the teeth of the wolf dog at his trousers made him turn and leave the house. Outside, he found Satan trembling between 2 temptations. The first to run as far and as fast as he could from that most terrible thing, fire, and the second to gallop straight into the blaze. The voice of the master, a touch, quieted him, and Black Bart lay down at the feet of the master and looked up into his face. By this time the fire had licked away a passage through the roof, and through this it sent up a yellow hand that flickered up and down like a signal or a beckoning, and then shot up a tall, steady, growing, roaring column of red. No man could say what went through the mind of Dan Barry as he stood there watching the house of his building burn. But now he turned and threw his arms over the neck and back of Satan and dropped his forehead against the withers of the black. It troubled the stallion. He turned his head and nosed the shoulder of the master gently, and Black Bart, in an agony of anxiety, reared up beside Dan and brought his head almost up to the head of the man. There he whined pleadingly, for never before had he seen the master hide his face. A deep, short report made the master stand away from Satan. The fire had reached a small stock of powder, and the shock of the explosion was followed by a great crashing and rending as an inner wall went down. That fall washed a solid mass of yellow flame across the front door, but the fire fell back, and then Dan saw the doll which he himself had made for Joan. It had been thrown by the smashing of the wall squarely in front of the door, and now the fire reached after it, long arms across the floor. It was an odd contrivance, singularly made of carved wood and with arms and legs fastened on by means of bits of strong sinew, and Joan prized it above all the rosy-faced dolls which Kate had bought for her. For an instant Dan stood watching the progress of the fire, then he leaped through the door, swerved back as an arm of fire shot out at him, ran forward again, caught up the doll, and was outside rubbing away the singed portions of brows and lashes. He did not wait until the house was consumed, but when the flames stood towering above the roof, shaking out to one side with a roar when the wind struck them, he mounted Satan once more and made for the valley. He wanted to reach Alder at dark, and he gauged the time of his ride so accurately that when he pulled out of the mouth of Murphy's Pass, The last light of the day was still on the mountains and in the pass, but it was already dark in the village, and a score of lights twinkled up at him like eyes. He left Satan and Bart well outside the town, for even in the dark they might easily be recognized, and then walked straight down the street of Alder. It was a bold thing to do, but he knew that the first thing which is seen and suspected is the skulker who approaches from covert to covert. They knew he had ridden into Alder before in the middle of the night, and they might suspect the danger of such another attack, but they surely would not have fear of a solitary pedestrian unless a telltale light were thrown upon his face. He passed Captain Lorrimer's saloon. Even in this short interval it had fallen into ill repute after the killing at Alder, and a shanty further down the street now did the liquor business of the town. Captain Lorrimer's was closed, and the window nailed across with slats. He went on, partly by instinct and partly because it was aflame with lights. He moved straight to the house at which he had learned tidings of 3 men he sought on his last visit to Alder. Now there were more lights showing from the windows of that place than there were in all the rest of Alder. At the hitching rack in front, horses stood tethered in long double rows, and a noise of voices rolled out and up and down the street. Undoubtedly there was a festival there, and all Alder would turn out for such an affair. All Alder, including Vic Gregg, the 7th man. A group came down the street for the widow's house. They were laughing and shouting, and they carried lanterns. Away from them Barry slipped like a ghost and stood in the shadow of the house. There might be other such crowds, and they were dangerous to Barry. So now he hunted for a means of breaking into the house of the widow unseen. The windows, as he went down the side of the building, he noted to be high, but not too high to be reached by a skillful, noiseless climber. In the back of the house he saw the kitchen door, illuminated indeed, but the room, as far as he could see, empty. Then very suddenly a wave of silence began somewhere in a side of the house and swept across it, dying to a murmur at the edges. Barry waited for no more maneuvers, but walked boldly up the back stairs and entered the house, hat in hand. The moment he passed the door he was alert, balanced. He could have swung to either side or whirled and shot behind him with the precision of a leisurely marksman. And as he walked he smiled, happily, with his head held high. He seemed so young then that one would have said he had just come in gaily from some game with the other youths of Alder. Out of the kitchen he passed into the hall, and there he understood the meaning of the silence, for both the doors to the front room were open, and through the doors he heard a single voice, deep and solemn, and through the doors he saw the crowd standing motionless. Their heads did not stir, heads on which the hair was plastered smoothly down. And when someone raised a hand to touch an itching ear or nose, he moved his arm in such caution that it seemed he feared to set a magazine of powder on fire. All their backs were towards Barry, where he stood in the hall, and as he glided toward them he heard the deep voice stop, and then the trembling voice of a girl speak in reply. At the first entrance he paused, for the whole scene unrolled before him. It was a wedding. Just in front of him, on chairs and even on benches, sat the majority of adult Alder. Facing these stood the wedding pair, with the minister just in front of them. He could see the girl to one side of the minister's back, and she was very pretty, very femininely appealing now, in a dress which was a cloudy effect of white. But Barry gave her only one sharp glance. His attention was for the men of the crowd, and although there were only backs of heads and side glimpses of faces, he hunted swiftly for Vic Gregg. But Gregg was not there. He surveyed the assembly twice, incredulous, for surely the tall man should be here. But when he was on the very point of turning on his heel and slinking down the hall to pursue his hunt in other quarters, the voice of the minister stopped, and the deep tone of Vic himself rolled through the room. It startled Barry like a voice out of the sky. He stared about, bewildered, and then as the minister shifted his position a little, he saw that it was Gregg who stood beside the girl in white. It was Gregg being married. And at the same moment the eyes of Vic lifted, wandered, fell upon the face which stood there framed in the dark of the doorway. Dan saw the flush die out, saw the narrow, single-purposed face of Gregg turn white, saw his eyes widen, and his own hand closed on his gun. Another instant. The minister turned his head, seemed to be waiting, and then Gregg spoke in answer. "I will." 1,000 pictures rushed through the mind of Barry, and he remembered first and last the wounded man on the gray horse who he had saved, and the long, hard ride carrying that limp body to the cabin in the mountains. The man would fight. By the motion of Gregg's hand, Dan knew that he had gone even to his wedding armed. He had only to show his own gun to bring on the crisis. And in the meantime the eyes of Vic held steadily upon him past the shoulder of the minister, without fear, desperately. In spite of himself, Dan's hand could not move his gun. In spite of himself, he looked to the confused, happy face of the girl, and he felt as he had felt when he set fire to his house up there in the hills. The wavering lasted only a moment longer. Then he turned and slipped noiselessly down the hall, and the seventh man who should have died for Grey Molly was still alive. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Seventh Man, the last chapter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 41. The Wild Geese. 24 hours from Alder to Elkhead, and beyond Elkhead to the Cumberland Ranch, is long riding and hard riding. But not far after dark on the following night, Joan lifted her head where she played with the puppy on the hearth, and listened. There was no sound audible to the others in the living room. They did not even mark the manner in which she sat up and then rose to her feet. But when she whispered, "Daddy Dan," it brought each of the three out of his chair. Still they heard nothing, and Buck and Lee Haines would have retaken their chairs had not Kate gone to the window and thrown it wide. Then they caught it, very far off, very thin and small, a delicate thread of music, an eerie whistling. Without a word she closed the window, crossed the room, and from the table she took up a cartridge belt from which hung the holster with the revolver which Whistling Dan had taught her to use so well. She buckled it around her. Lee Haines and Daniels, without a word, imitated her actions. Their guns were already on. Every moment since they reached the ranch they had gone armed, but now they looked to them and tried the actions a few times before they thrust them back into the holsters. It was odd to watch them. They were like the last remnant of a garrison, outworn with fighting, which prepares in grim quiet for the final stand. The whistling rose a little in volume now. It was a happy sound, without a recognizable tune, but a gay, wild improvisation, as if a violinist, drunk, was remembering snatches of masterpieces, throwing out lovely fragments here and there, and filling the intervals out of his own excited fancy. Joan ran to the window, forgetful of the puppy, and kneeled there in the chair looking out. The whistling stopped as Kate drew down the curtain to cut out Joan's view. It was far too dark for the child to see out, but she often would sit like this, looking into the dark. The whistling began again as Joan turned silently on her mother, uncomplaining, but with a singular glint in her eyes, a sort of flickering, inward light that came out by glances and starts. Now the sound of the rider grew closer and closer. Kate gestured the men to their positions, one for each of the two inner doors, while she herself took the outer one. There was not a trace of color in her face, but otherwise she was as calm as a stone, and from her an atmosphere pervaded the room, so the men also stood quietly at their posts, without a word, without a sign to each other. They had their unspoken order from Kate. She would resist to the death, and she expected the same from them. They were prepared. Still, that crescendo of the whistling continued. It seemed as if it would never reach them. It grew loud as a bird singing in that very room, and still it continued to swell, increase, then suddenly went out. As if it were the signal for which she had been waiting all these heartbreaking moments, Kate opened the front door, ran quickly down the hall, and stood an instant later on the path in front of the house. She had locked the doors as she went through, and now she heard one of the men rattling the lock to follow her. The rattling ceased. Evidently they decided that they would hold the fort as they were. Her heel hardly sank in the sand when she saw him. He came out of the night like a black shadow among shadows, with the speed of the wind to carry him. A light creak of leather as he halted, a glimmer of starlight on Satan as he wheeled, a clink of steel, and then Dan was coming up the path. She knew him perfectly, even before she could make out the details of the form. She knew him by the light, swift, almost noiseless step, like the padding footfall of a great cat, a sense of weight without sound. Another form skulked behind him, Black Bart. He was close, very close before he stopped or seemed to see her, though she felt that he must have been aware of her since he first rode up. He was so close indeed that the starlight, the brim of his hat standing up somewhat from the swift riding, showed his face quite clearly to her. It was boyish almost, in its extreme youth, and so thinly molded, and his frame so lightly made, that he seemed one risen from a wasted bed of sickness. The wind fluttered his shirt, and she wondered, as she had wondered so often before, where he gained that incredible strength in so meager a body. In all her life she had never loved him as she loved him now, but her mind was as fixed as a star. "You can't have her, Dan. You can't have her. Don't you see how terrible a thing you'd make her? She's my blood, my pain, my love, and you want to take her up yonder to the mountains and the loneliness. I'll die to keep her." Now the moon, which had been buried in a drift of clouds, broke through them, and seemed on an instant to slide a vast distance toward the earth, a crooked half-moon with its edges eaten by the mist. Under this light she could see him more clearly, and she became aware of the thing she dreaded, the faint smile which barely touched at the corners of his mouth, and in his eyes a swirl of yellow light, half guessed at, half real. All her strength poured out of her. She felt her knees buckle, felt the fingers about the light revolver butt relax, felt every nerve grow slack. She was helpless. And it was not fear of the man, but something which stalked behind him, inhuman, irresistible, not the wolf dog, but something more than Satan and Bart and Whistling Dan, something of which they were only a part. He began to whistle, thoughtfully, like one who considers a plan of action and yet hesitates to begin. She felt his eyes run over her, as if judging how he should put her most gently to one side. Then from the house, very lightly, hardly more than an echo of Dan's whistling, came an answer, the very same refrain. Joan was calling to him. At that he stepped forward, but the thing which stirred him had hardened the mind of Kate. The weakness passed in a flash. It was Joan, and for Joan. "Not a step," she whispered, and jerked out her gun. "Not a step." He stood with one hand trailing carelessly from his hip, and at the gleam of her steel his other hand dropped to his holster, fumbled there, and came away empty. He could not touch her, not with the weight of a finger. That thoughtful whistle came again. Once more the answering whistle drifted out from the house, and he moved forward another pace. She had chosen her mark carefully, the upper corner of the seam of the pocket upon his shirt, and before his foot struck the ground, she fired. For an instant she felt she had missed the mark, for he stood perfectly upright. But then she saw that the yellow was gone from his eyes. They were empty of everything except a great wonder. He wavered to his knees, and then sank down with his arms around Black Bart. He seemed indeed to crumple away into the night. Then she heard a shouting and trampling in the house, and a breaking open of doors, and she knew that she had killed Whistling Dan. She would have gone to him, but the snarl of Bart drove her back. Then she saw Satan galloping up the path and come to a sliding halt where he stood, with his delicate nose close to the face of the master. There was no struggle with death, only a sigh like a motion of wind in far-off trees, and then, softly, easily, Black Bart extricated himself from the master and moved away down the path, all wolf, all wild. Behind him, Satan whirled with a snort, and they rushed away into the night, each in an opposite direction. The long companionship of the three was ended, and the seventh man was dead for Grey Molly. Lee Haines and Buck Daniels were around her now. She heard nothing distinctly, only a great vague clamor of voices while she kneeled and turned the body of Barry on its back. It was marvelously light. She could almost have picked it up in her arms, she felt. She folded the hands across his breast, and the limp fingers were delicate as the fingers of a sick child. Buck Daniels lay prone by the dead man, weeping aloud, and Lee Haines stood with his face buried in his hands. But there were no tears on the face of Kate. As she closed the eyes, the empty, hollow eyes, she heard a distant calling, a hoarse and dissonant chiming. She looked up and saw a wedge of wild geese flying low across the moon. End of The Seventh Man by Max Brand. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robert Kuiper. Fairfax, Virginia, December 2009, January 2010.